Draft. Triads 1 beginning without recourse to any cognitions other than elementary, any findings other than basic, we can put forward the following propositions. The modern world is Hegelian. In fact, Hegel elaborated and drove to its ultimate conclusions the political theory of the nation-state. He asserted the supreme reality and value of the state. Hegelianism posits, in principle, the linkage of knowledge and power. It legitimizes it. Now, the number of states has steadily risen, around 150 today. They cover the surface of the globe. Even if it is true that nations and nation-states are no longer anything but facades and covers, hiding wider capitalist realities, world market, multinational corporations, these facades and covers are nonetheless a reality, not the most subtle, but effective instruments and frameworks. Whatever the ideology that inspires it, the state asserts itself everywhere, indissolubly using both knowledge and constraint, its reality and its value, the definite and definitive character of the state, conservative and even counter-revolutionary, whatever the official ideology, even revolutionary, is confirmed in the political consciousness it imposes. In this perspective, the state encompasses and subordinates to itself the reality that Hegel called civil society, that is, social relations. It claims to contain and define civilization. B. The modern world is Marxist. For the last few decades, in fact, the fundamental concerns of so-called public authorities have been economic growth, viewed as the basis of national existence and independence, and therefore industrialization, production, which leads to problems around the relation of the working class, productive workers, to the nation-state, as well as a new relationship between knowledge and production, hence between this knowledge and the powers that control production. It is neither obvious nor certain that knowledge should be subordinate to political power, or that the state has eternity on its side. Rational economic planning is on today's agenda, achieved in different ways, direct or indirect, complete or partial. In the course of a century, industry and its consequences have changed the world. In other words, society, more, if not better, than ideas, political projects, dreams and utopias, as Marx had basically proclaimed and predicted. C. The modern world is Nietzschean. If anyone wanted to change life, though these words are attributed to Rambo, it was certainly Nietzsche. If anyone wanted everything right now, it was him. Protests and challenges against the state of things are converging from all sides. Individual life and lived experience Loviku are reasserting themselves against political pressures, against productivism and economism. When it does not just oppose one policy to another, protest finds support in poetry, in music, in theater, as well as in the expectation and hope for something extraordinary, the surreal, the supernatural, the superhuman. Civilization worries many people, more than the state or society. Despite the efforts of political forces to assert themselves above lived experience, to subordinate society to themselves and capture art, this contains the reserve of contestation, the resource of protest, despite what is pushing it into decline. This corresponds to the raging wind of Nietzschean revolt, the stubborn defense of civilization against the pressures of society, state and morality. None of the above propositions, taken separately in isolation, has the look of a paradox. It is possible to show that the modern world is Hegelian or to refute it by classic procedures. If someone wants to prove it, they would have to reconstruct Hegel's philosophico-political system as far as possible, on the basis of his texts. Then they would study the influence of this doctrine and its penetration by various paths into political life, the university, the interpretation of events, the blind activity of politicians, subsequently elucidated, etc. The same holds for Marx and for Nietzsche, but, stated together, there is something intolerably paradoxical about them. How can this modern world be at the same time one thing and another? How can it pertain to doctrines that are diverse, opposed on more than one point, even incompatible? Neither can it be a matter of influence, or simply reference. If the modern world is at the same time this and that, Hegelian and Nietzschean, be a matter of ideologies that float above social and political practice like bright and dark patches, clouds and rays of light. An assertion of this kind forces it also cannot us to grasp and define new relations between these theories' doctrines, as well as between the theories and practice. If this triplicity has a meaning, it is that each of them, Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, grasped something of the modern world, something in the process of happening, and that each doctrine, insofar as it achieved a coherence, Hegelianism, Marxism, Nietzscheanism, declared what it grasped, and by this declaration contributed to what was being formed in the late 19th century, to reach the 20th century and across it, with the result that confrontation between these outstanding works involves a mediation, the modernity that they illuminate and that illuminates them. In an earlier book, these doctrines were confronted with historicism and historicity. Here, this critical analysis is expanded, while seeking to remain concrete. If it is true that Hegelian thought is focused in one word and one concept, the state, that Marxist thought strongly emphasizes the social and society, and that Nietzsche meditated on civilization and values, then through the paradox we glimpse a meaning that remains to be discovered, a triple determination of the modern world, implying conflicts that are multiple and perhaps without end, within so-called human reality. This is a hypothesis whose scope permits us to say that it has a strategic import. 3. To study Hegel, Marx or Nietzsche in isolation, in the texts, would not take us very far. All textual connections have been explored, all their constructions and reconstructions, without the authenticity of one or other interpretation prevailing. As for situating them in the history of philosophy, in general history or the history of ideas, the interest of such a contextual study seems as exhausted as does textual analysis. What remains to be grasped, then, is their relationship with the modern world, taking this as the referent, as the central object of analysis, as the common measure, mediation, between the various doctrines and ideologies that insert themselves in it. The contextual thus acquires an amplitude and scope, a richness of unknown and known, that is omitted when reduced to a certain The contextual thus acquires an amplitude and scope, a richness of unknown and known, that is omitted when reduced to a certain particular or general history. In what way did Hegel, Marx and Nietzsche each respectively anticipate the tendencies of modernity in its nascent state? How did they grasp what was in the course of tacking? How did they fix one aspect and define one moment among the contradictory aspects and moments? 3 stars, but one constellation. Sometimes the light from each is superimposed, sometimes one hides or eclipses the other. They interfere, the brightness of each either grows or pales. They rise or descend to the horizon, draw away from one another or converge. Sometimes one seems dominant, sometimes another. The above statements have only a metaphorical significance and a symbolic value. They indicate the direction and the horizon. They declare, what remains to be shown, that the greatness of these works and these men is no longer like that of the classical philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, Descartes and Kant, who constructed a great architecture of concepts. This greatness consists in a certain relationship to the real, to practice. So, it is not of a philological order, representable on the basis of language, new, metaphilosophical. It has to be defined on the basis of deciphering the enigma of modernity. 4. Let us look again at Hegelianism. Nothing says that this will be the last look. Enormous, pivotal. Hegel holds pride of place at the end of classical philosophy, on the verge of modernity, a solitary figure, yet he gathered together a historico-philosophical totality and subordinated it to the state. What makes for his modernity? First of all, he gave systematic form to Western logos, whose genesis began with the Greeks, ancient philosophy in the ancient city, like Aristotle, but after 2,000 years, and taking into account what had been learned in the course of history, Hegel identified the terms categories of effective discourse and showed how they were connected in a coherent ensemble, a knowledge, source and meaning, finality, of all consciousness. Though impersonal, logos does not rest suspended in midair. Reason presupposes a subject that is just a particular individual, an accidental personal consciousness. This rationality is embodied in the statesman, and realized in the state itself, with the result that the state is situated at the highest philosophical level, above the eminent determinations of knowledge and consciousness. Concept and subject. It envelops these developmental conquests. It even encompasses logically, in a supreme cohesion, the results of struggles and wars. In other words, of historical, dialectical, contradictions. The state, as absolute philosophical subject in which rationality is embodied, itself embodies the idea, that is divinity. Hence those thundering declarations, which we shall have to return to, as it is impossible to let them settle into the false serenity and lying legitimacy of established philosophy, institutional and recognized as such. Since the state is the actuality of the idea, objective spirit, the individual has no objective, truth or ethical existence except as member of the state. The state conceives itself through the thoughts of individuals who say L, and it realizes itself through individuals and groups who say we. The historical origin of the state, of each state, does not affect the idea of the state. Knowledge, will, freedom, subjectivity, are only moments, elements, phases or stages, of the idea as it is realized in the state, both in itself and for itself. Hegel thus legitimizes the fusion of knowledge and power in the state, the former subordinated to the latter. Organizational effectiveness and constraining violence, including war, link up and compete in the state, the former justifying the latter in a perfect reciprocity, and assembling in the political order things that seem spontaneous, family, work and trades, etc. The repressive capacity of the state is thus revealed to be basically rational, hence legitimate, which by the same token legitimizes and justifies both wars in particular and war in general. For Hegel as for Machiavelli, violence is a component of political life and the state, on top of which it has a content and a meaning. It opens the path of reason, law, constraining, and right, normative, are necessary and sufficient for society and its complex mechanisms to function under the control of the state, and they denote the same political reality. Thus the rationality inherent to all moments of history and to everyday practice is focused in the state. This legitimately and sovereignly totalizes morality and right, law, the social institutions and their particular functions, family, nations and corporations, cities and regions of the national territory, the system of needs and the division of labor, which corresponds precisely to needs, just as consciousness has a triple origin. Sensation, practical activity, abstraction, which raises it to the higher level of political consciousness. So the state has a triadic origin, productive work, history and its conflicts, and socio-political practice that brings it to perfection. These associated and interacting triplicities produce a living totality both organic and rational. The state, viewed genetically, this is nothing other than reasoning humanity, obeying the call of the idea, which produces itself in the course of history. In short, the state cements and crowns the social body, which without this would fragment into pieces, would atomize if such a hypothesis makes any sense. The Hegelian fetishism of the state may frighten the citizen or the reader of a philosophical work, and the summary that will be submitted, once more, to such a reader may perhaps appear monstrous, without any relationship to political reality, but this impression will fade as soon as the exposition goes into the detail of the Hegelian analysis and synthesis, which are striking and astonish by their character, both concrete and actual. Modern, b. According to Hegel, the rational, thus constitutional, state, has a social basis, the middle class. It is in this class that culture is located, which connects with the consciousness of the state. There is no modern state without a middle class, its foundation for both intelligence and legality. Neither the peasants nor the workers, the working and productive classes, can constitute pillars of the state. It is from this middle class that civil servants are recruited, either by cooptation or by competition. A competent bureaucracy, selected by tough examinations, is a true social basis and substance of the state. For Hegel, there are thus social classes and even struggles, contradictions between these classes: the natural class, the peasants, rooted in the soil; the active reflective class, artisans and workers, who produce the accumulation of wealth, these individuals being characterized by their subjective skill; and finally the thinking class, mediator between the two productive classes, and itself mediated by its knowledge, which maintains and manages the social whole within the context of the state. These three classes constitute civil society, with its intermediary, mediation towards politics. In other words, the bureaucracy, emerging from the thinking class, middle, intermediary, mediating and mediated. Conflicts between these classes, the elements, moments, of civil society, presses out outside and above itself, towards the establishment of a political class, directly immediately, that is, without mediation, bound up with the state and thus constituting its apparatus. It is the upper fringe of the bureaucracy that institutes in the constitution the lower part of the personnel in power, around princes, monarchs and heads of state. Thus, it is the contradictions, the internal dialectic, of civil society that engender the state and the political class. This latter, representing and effecting state action, can turn back on its own conditions. It has the capacity of recognizing social relations between the moments, elements, members, phases, stages, of civil society, of detecting their conflicts and resolving them, in such a way that the state is preserved as a coherent totality encompassing contradictory moments. With this aim, the ruling stratum, political class, is entitled to free itself from all other tasks and obligations, and consequently to receive prizes and rewards, honors, money, for exercising its responsibility. The result is that this fundamentally honest class, the summit of the pyramid, does not only represent the social substance, it is this substance, in other words the life of the whole, the constant production, reproduction, of society, state, constitution, the political act itself, which consists in governing. Philosophy, for its part, is a duplicate and shadow of the completed political system. The perfect philosophical system consecrates, legitimates, founds it. Philosophy as such is perfected in Hegelianism, which sums up and condenses its history. It finds full realization in the state to which the system brings theory. Philosophy accompanies the state as a public service, in the same way that the state rationally totalizes its historical, practical, social, cultural and other moments. So the philosophico-political system unites the rational and the real, the abstract and the concrete, the ideal and the actual, the possible and the accomplished. Knowledge, theoretical, and practice, socio-political, likewise coincide in administrative savoir-faire. The consequence, or rather the logical implication of this, is that history has reached an end. In terms of production, it has generated everything that it could generate. When? With the French Revolution and Napoleon. Why? Because the Revolution and Napoleon produced what supersedes and consecrates them. The nation-state, marked by struggle and emergence, the figures of the individual and social consciousness, the phases of cognition. Historicity reproduces its initial condition and its final content, the idea. It contains three moments: productive work, self-generated conceptual knowledge and the creative struggle through which the higher moment is born from the lower, dominating this by subjecting, and thereby preserving, it, origin, hidden, and end, manifest, of all things, of every act and every event. The idea recognizes itself in the plenitude of the state. Accident and contingency are either non-existent, or no more than apparent. With the modern state, time comes to an end, and the result of time is displayed, actualized in total presence, in space. This is the twilight of creation, the setting sun, the west, the trinity or speculative triad. Work, action, thought, is completed in its triumph, and 10 enters into its starry night. Into mortal wisdom Datu would not feel a frisson of terror at comparing the monstrously rational character of Hegel's theory of the state with the concrete character of the detailed analyses that support and actualize this. The rise of the middle class above the working classes, the growing socio-economic importance of this middle class, combined with its illusory political importance, the subordination of the socio-economic base to a bureaucracy, a technocracy, an upper class that emerges from the middle class, the formation of a political class. All these aspects of modernity were grasped, foreseen, announced by Hegel at the start of the 19th century. Along with this was the revelation of another aspect that is overlooked, ignored or dissimulated in the modern world, the true portrait of the monster, seen from its cruelly thinking head to its active members, the superhuman and too human giant of the state. We shall have to return to this paradox, Hegel's tripod monster and his rational vision, the philosopher's approval and the good conduct certificate given by philosophy, the juncture of knowledge and power, of Western logos and raison d'etre, this intolerable ensemble of truth. Starting from this central conception, the Hegelian state produced its moments, its elements, its materials, in historical time, in the resulting space. It reproduces them in an immobile movement, since each member dissolves as soon as it sets itself apart. The movement, the revolving sphere, the round, in a word, the system, are also transparent and serene rest, in the words of the phenomenology of spirit. Thus, the Hegelian state offers a model of a self-generated and self-maintained system that regulates itself. In other words, the perfect automatism, architectonic colossus, necessary and sufficient. It is so. Is first so. These were supposedly the last words of the dying Hegel. 5. Let us now reconsider what is currently known as Marxism. Do I need to repeat that this is not the first time and will not be the last either? Preliminary remark. Hegelianism can be defined as a system. True. Specialists in the history of philosophy are familiar with the difficulties arising from the diversity of Hegel's texts and their dates. Agreement between Hegel's phenomenology, description and linkage of figures and moments of consciousness, both for the individual and for humanity and its progress, and his logic, which includes the relation of formal logic, theory of coherence, with dialectic, theory of contradictions, as well as with history sequence of struggles, violence, wars and revolutions, has nothing like Cartesian self-evidence. Yet we can be confident that Hegelian thought, in the course of the philosopher's life, focused in a definable direction, that of the philosophical and political system. What then of Marxism? This is only a word, a political label, a polemical amalgam. Only an outdated dogmatism still tries to find in Marx's works a homogeneous body of doctrine, a system, between the works of his youth, those of his maturity and those of his latter years. There is more than diversity, and anything but a quiet plant-like development. There are fissures, gaps, contradictions, incoherencies. Take dialectics, for example, which is first of all exalted and turned against Hegel like a weapon seized from the enemy, then denied and rejected, then taken up in a renewed form that Marx never clearly explained. In so far as it is possible to draw our body of doctrine from a monumental work such as Capital. It refers to competitive capitalism, whose disappearance Marx foresaw and proclaimed. But why stubbornly stick to constructing an ensemble of this kind? Given that the work was not completed, why conceive it as a totality adequate to the mode of production that it analyses and explains? Capitalism. It may well be that the final chapters, no less rich than the opening ones, contain discoveries that appear only by confronting them with what emerged from competitive capitalism in the 20th century. Marx's thought may today play a similar role as does Newton's physics in relation to modern physics, the physics of relativity. Nuclear energy, atoms and molecules, a staging post for going further, a truth at a certain level, a date in a word, a moment which prohibits, on the one hand, dogmatism, Marxist rhetoric, and on the other, presumptuous discourse on the death of Marx and Marxism. Let us make this attitude clear right away. The reasons for it will appear later. It is not a question of reconsidering Marx's thought, following the usual schema of revisionism, as a function of what has been new in the world over the last century. On the contrary, the correct and legitimate procedure consists in the determination of what is new in the world on the basis of Marx's work. This is how changes in the productive forces, the relations of production, social structures and superstructures, ideological and institutional, manifest themselves. Today there are multiple Marxisms, and it is a vain effort to try and reduce them to a single model. The thought of Marx and Engels was grafted onto concepts and values that were already widespread in the countries where it penetrated. Hence the birth of a Chinese Marxism and a Soviet, Russian, Marxism, of Marxist schools in Germany, Italy, France and the English-speaking countries. Hence the diversity and unevenness of theoretical development. The graft took either well or less well. In France, the Cartesian spirit, fundamentally anti-dialectical, offered neither a terrain nor a favorable mentor. The graft only bore fruit. Belatedly, which did not mean these were of poor quality. What relationship did Marx's thought have with that of Hegel? This question, which as everyone knows has led to a flood of ink being spilled, requires just one answer. Marx's dialectical thought had a relationship with Hegel's dialectical thought that was itself dialectical, which means unity and conflict. Marx took from Hegel the essentials of his essentialist thought, the importance of work and production, the self-production of the human species, of man, the rationality immanent to practice, consciousness and knowledge, as also to political struggles, hence the meaning of history. It is possible to find in Hegel, as also in a Saint Simon, almost everything that Marx said, including the role of work, production, classes, etc., with the result that it is impossible to deny the continuity between the two thinkers, yet the order and linkage, orientation and perspective, content and form, differ radically, so that the impression of a brusque discontinuity is no less striking than that of an uninterrupted continuity. Throughout his life, Marx struggled against Hegel, to wrest from him his ill-gotten gains and transform these by appropriating them. What was Hegel for Marx? At the same time the father, possessor of the inheritance, and the boss and owner of the means of production, acquired knowledge. In their struggle, there was a generational quarrel but also a class struggle. This combat went through phases with varying fortunes, highs and lows, victories and defeats, by one or other combatant. The stakes changed, either knowledge as totality or dialectic as method, or the theory of the state, etc. Contrary to Hegel, Marx used whatever he could lay hands on. He passed Hegelianism through the sieve of anthropology, Feuerbach, political economy, Smith, Ricardo, historiography, the historians of the French Restoration, especially Adolphe Thierry in the history of the Third Estate, philosophy, French materialism of the 18th century and nascent sociology, Saint Simon and Fourier. From this sieving and filtering, this critical negation, emerged a different thought and above all a different project, Marxism, built from the materials of a reprised and metamorphosed Hegelianism. This struggle ran from radical critique of Hegel's theses on law and the state, on philosophy, to refutation of the Hegelian political strategy accepted by Ferdinand Lassalle. No one today is unaware of how Marx understood and approved the Paris Commune, as destructive of the state. He opposed this revolutionary practice to the state socialism that was unfortunately coming to dominate the German workers' movement, and would do so for a very long period, as it still persists today. In the course of this theoretical struggle, Marx never lost sight for a moment of the practical objective of the real stake, which is not the constitution of a system opposed to Hegelianism, but analysis of social practice in the modern world, in order to act and transform these on the basis of their immanent tendencies, continuity and discontinuity. There is therefore a break, a point of rupture. Where should we situate this? Drawing on both texts and contexts, we can maintain that this break was neither philosophical transition from idealism to materialism, nor epistemological transition from ideology to science. These two aspects are encompassed in a more complex break, richer in both content and meaning, a political break. It was not true, for Marx, that philosophy, reason and truth, fullness and happiness as conceived by the philosophers, was realized in the state and ended in a constraining system. The working class would realize philosophy by a total revolution. But this was no longer classical philosophy, abstract, speculative, systematic. The realization of philosophy is accomplished in practice, in a way of living, by superseding traditional philosophy, by superseding itself. The proletariat opens up limitless possibilities. Time, so-called historical time, continues. Hegelian superseding, or Verbann, takes on a quite different meaning. The state itself is to be dispensed with through the ordeal of supersession. The revolution breaks it and leads to its withering away. It is absorbed or reabsorbed in society. Thus, the political break presupposes the philosophical break, rupture with classic philosophy, and the epistemological break, rupture with ideologies. Those are the dominant class, as its moments. As for reason, it has no definitive form or formula. It develops through superseding, by resolving its own contradictions between the rational and the irrational, the conceived and lived experience, theory and practice, etc. Thus, the state does not possess any higher rationality, still less a definitive one. Hegel takes it as the structure of society, while for Marx it is only a superstructure. It is constructed, or rather people politicians, statesmen constructed on a base, the social relations of production and ownership, the productive forces. The base then changes, so the state has no other reality than that of a historical moment. It changes along with the base. It is modified, crumbles, is rebuilt differently, then perishes and disappears, as the productive forces advance from the use of natural riches to the technical mastery of nature, automatism, and from divided labor, alienating, to non-labor. The state cannot but be transformed. It has already changed profoundly from the feudal military period to the monarchical period, and from this to the democratic period introduced by industrialization. Capitalism and the hegemony of the bourgeois class accommodate themselves to a democracy simultaneously liberal and authoritarian. This democracy and its state, parliamentary, are only for a time. History, which according to Hegel had been completed, continues for Marx. Uncompleted time does not freeze, reify, in space, the space of commercial relations, industrial production or state domination. The production of things, products, encompasses the production of social relations. This double production, too, cannot be frozen reified into a simple reproduction of the same things and the same relations. Thus, there is no reproduction of the past or the present without the production of something new. This is the original form that the Hegelian dialectic acquires with Marx. The revolutionary creation of new relations cannot be avoided, even by the use of political instruments, constraint and persuasion, ideological rationality. This turns out to be inherent to social practice, and culminates, though without conclusion, in industrial practice. The everyday, transformed along with social relations, it will bring happiness to men. Marxist optimism intrepidly maintains. As for the state, a double movement runs through it. On the one hand, it manages the whole society in terms of the hegemony of the dominant and ruling class. In terms of its present interests and its strategic projects, it accordingly generates an educational system, practical knowledge, connaissance, and ideologies, social services such as medicine and teaching, according to the interests of the hegemonic, dominant, class. At the same time, it raises itself above the whole of society, with the result that those individuals who possess the state, whether fraction of the hegemonic class or declasses, may end up dominating and even exploiting for a time the economically dominant class, taking away its hegemony. This happens with Bonapartism, fascism, a state resulting from a military coup, etc. This contradiction internal to the state is added to the external contradictions that arise from its conflictual relations with its base, itself pervaded by contradictions. Hence the impossibility of a stabilization of the state, a provisional form of society, with its more or less integrated moments, in other words, more or less dominated and appropriated, knowledge and logic, technology and strategy, law and moral ideology, etc. The state does not rest on the middle class. Its base does not coincide with this class, but encompasses all social relations. Today, accordingly, it is the state of the bourgeoisie. It needs a bureaucracy, which effectively means a middle class, which tends to become parasitic as well as competent, by raising itself above the whole society along with the state, not without conflicts with the owners of the means of production, that is, with the other fractions of the ruling class. Marx places at the center of his analysis of the real, and likewise of his project, the social force able to overturn the state and the social relations on which it is based and which transform it, in other words, to destroy it first of all so as to bring it to an end. If the working class asserts itself by becoming a collective subject, then the state as subject of history will die. If the state escapes its fate, if it does not collapse, if it does not fracture and wither away, this means that the working class has been unable to become an autonomous collective subject. By becoming autonomous, the working class replaces the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie with its own hegemony. Its dictatorship, what prevents the self-determination and assertion of the proletariat as subject, as ability to manage the means of production and the whole society? Violence. Violence is inherent to the subject when it breaks obstacles. This is its only meaning and scope. In the case of the working class, violence puts an end to the state, and to politicians raising themselves above the social, proletarian, revolutionary. Violence self-destructs instead of destroying the world. By itself it produces nothing, is in no way creative. We may say of violence that it is a permanent quality or property of a self-asserting social being. According to Marx, this class cannot realize itself without superseding itself. By this act, it realizes philosophy by superseding it. For Marx, the social can and must reabsorb the two other levels of so-called human reality, on the one hand politics and the state, which lose their dominant character and wither away, and on the other hand economics, the productive forces, which organize themselves within society, by a rational management according to the interests of the producers, the workers, themselves, the social, and consequently social needs, those of society as a whole, define the new society that is born from the old by revolution. Socialism and communism are characterized on the one hand by the end of the state and its primacy, and on the other hand by the end of economics and its priority. In the economic social political triad, it is the social and society that Marx emphasizes, and the concept of which he developed. Some would say that he banked on the social against the economic and the political, which had priority before the reversal of this world in which they had primacy. Others would say that Marx established a strategy on the basis of analyzing tendencies in the real, the existing, with the social asserting itself as such. Marxist thought is inspired by an immense optimism, an optimism that many people today label with a word that has lost its favorable connotations and is seen as denoting an uncertain naivety, humanism. Happiness would arise from the conflictual play of forces, and especially from the conflicts between nature, the spontaneous creation of wealth, reserves and resources, and anti-nature, work, technology, machines. The triad of nature, work and knowledge is the bearer of fortune. A certain paradox continues to surprise, always new despite being very well known, the lasting influence of this optimism, despite its repeated setbacks. Marxism has failed, particularly and especially in the large number of countries that claim to adhere to it. In these so-called socialist countries, specifically social relations, association, cooperation, self-management, autogestion, etc., are crushed between economics and politics, to the point of having no acknowledged existence. They are reduced, as in capitalist countries, to private relations, personal communication interaction in everyday discourse, the family, relations of formal socializing and business, at best a friendship or complicity. This crushing of the social under the banner of socialism adds a further mystification to an already long list. Rationalism against reason, nationalism against the 14 nation, individualism against the individual, etc. In this strange list, certain labels gradually fall into disuse. Rationalism, for example, and its relationship with the irrational and the rational, with others take their place. Socialism against the social, is a good replacement for any other opposition that is now obsolescent. And yet, here or there, a ray of sunlight breaks through. It emerges from the economic against the political, which shows the complexity of the situation. Failures of Marxist thought, yes. Death, no. This situation is eminently paradoxical, and also one we shall have to return to. 6. We turn now to Nietzsche and Nietzschean thought. Inasmuch as this is still a thought, this does not mean that the following reflections exhaust the situation of which this thought is part. We should not approach it without circumspection. The Cartesian mind is seized by terror as soon as it enters the world of Nietzsche. 116 History, for Nietzsche as for Marx, contrary to Hegel, it continues under a double form. On the one hand, absurd wars, endless violence, barbarities, genocides, and on the other, an immense, cumulative knowledge, ever more crushing, made up of scholarship, quotations, an amalgam of actions and representations, memories and techniques, speculations that are of little interest but supremely entrusted. What continues, therefore, is not history historicity, as conceived by Hegel, a genesis of ever more complex realities, productive capacities that finally culminate in the edifice of the state, nor is it history according to Marx, leading towards neither divinity nor the state, but towards humanity, the fullness of the human species, perfection of its essence, domination over matter and appropriation of nature, the Hegelian hypothesis, which Nietzsche was familiar with, and 77 attacked violently in his untimely meditations, and the Marxist hypothesis, which Nietzsche rejected, via Hegel, without knowing it, were for him no more than theological. They presupposed that thought or practical action had a meaning. Without demonstrating this, they postulated a direction, an immanent rationality, a divinity in humanity, or in the world. But God is dead. The atheism of Feuerbach, Stirner or Marx misunderstood the import of this assertion. Philosophers and their accomplices continue to reason to philosophize, as if God were not dead. But along with God died history, man and humanity, reason and rationality, finality and meaning. Whether proclaimed by theologians as a higher entity, or secularized, placed in nature or in history, God was the support of philosophical architectures, systems, dogmas and doctrines. What then is history? A chaos of chances, desires, determinisms. In this Nietzschean triad, taken over from the Greeks, chance holds the first place. The revelation and acceptance of chance, even the apologia for it, give a new dimension to freedom, declares Zarathustra. By breaking the slavery of finality, there is no event without a conjunction or conjuncture of forces initially external to one another, which meet up at a point in space and time where something happens in the wake of this encounter. Chance offers opportunities, favorable conjunctures, the charis of the Greeks. Chances end up being organized according to our most personal needs, wrote Nietzsche. Why? Because what emerges in the face of analysis as well as in life is the will, not the pallid faculty of classical psychology, the will of the subject who says one want, but the will to power, pure sense, the active energy that seeks not a particular advantage from power, but power for itself, to dominate. As Hegel saw, following Heraclitus, there is struggle, combat, war, but for Nietzsche, the struggle of wills to power replaces Hegel's rational historicity and dialectical overthrow, which Marx followed, modifying the Hegelian terms, an overthrow through which the slave conquers the conqueror, the master, so advancing in the direction of history. The third term of the triad, determinism. Necessity. According to Nietzsche, there is not and cannot be a unique necessity, an exclusive determinism, physical, biological, historical, economic, political, etc. There are multiple determinisms, which are born and die, grow and disappear after having undergone a certain path, played a certain role in nature or society, a role more often disastrous than beneficial. So, history is not strictly speaking a chaos. It can be analyzed and understood, but the understanding of history shows it to be irreducible to an immanent rationality, a progress determinable in advance. In any historical sequence, elements and symptoms of decadence can be discerned, even within something still strengthening. The shocks of violence shatter anything that seeks to establish itself in a fixed mold. Partial determinisms, biological, physical, social, intellectual, allow genealogies, such as that of a particular family, a discovery, an idea or a concept, far more than they do genes, explanations by a producing activity. Hegel, and Marx after him, refused to disconnect the rational from the real. They took the point of view of a logico-dialectical identity of the two terms unity and contradiction and struggle, victory of a third term born from this struggle. According to Nietzsche, however, this is the root of a fundamental error. It rationally associates fact with value or meaning, but facts have no more meaning than a pebble on a mountain or an isolated noise. As for nature, it has no meaning, rather offering the possibility of countless meanings, in a mixture of cruelty and generosity, joy and suffering, pleasure and pain, a mixture with no name. Man, by a choice, confers a meaning on nature, on natural life, on the things of nature. Man is not a being that endlessly questions the world and himself, but a being that creates meanings and value, which he does as soon as he names things, evaluating them by speaking of them. Very likely, there are only facts and things for and by such evaluation. Does knowledge contribute a value? Does it give meaning to objects and things? No, says Nietzsche against Hegel. In fact, as pure and abstract knowledge, it strips the world of meaning. As for work, Nietzsche agrees with Marx that it has and gives meaning and value, but not the labor that manufactures products, only work that is creative. Who evaluates? Who names? Who lives according to a value? Who chooses a value? 1. This is how the question of the subject is posited, to which a response is necessary in order for the quest for a new meaning to retain a meaning, a question that it is hard to answer, since the answer presupposes a return to the original, by giving the subject and its relationship with meaning a genesis. Hence Nietzsche's uncertainty is significant in themselves. Sometimes he says that peoples invent meanings, create values. The philosopher and the poet keep aloof from the crowds, yet they emerge from the peoples, even and especially when opposed to their 18 people. It is peoples that invent, and not states or nations or classes, which give no more meaning and value to anything than does knowledge or politics. This thesis posits in principle a complete relativism, a perspectivism that is nonetheless convergent with Marxist positions, as it attributes to peoples, and consequently to the masses, the creative capacity of generating a perspective on the basis of an evaluation. Sometimes Nietzsche replies on the contrary that only the individual of genius has this capacity, an elitist position. We, who indissolubly perceive and think, we ceaselessly bring to birth that which is not yet, he proudly declares in Die Frohliche Wissenschaft. Nietzsche's thought, in other words, inasmuch as it is a thought, does not flinch from contradictions and incoherencies. But is it necessary to choose between these propositions? Are we faced with a system, a knowledge, or rather the transition from one knowledge to another, from sad science to gay science? What then is this gay science, opposed both to the absolute science of Hegel and the critical science of Marx? Without awaiting a deeper reconsideration of the central point, it is useful to give right away here the genealogy of the Frohliche Wissenschaft. It has its origin in what is deepest in the West, a subterranean current combated and buried by Judeo-Christian morality and Greco-Roman logos, against which Nietzsche waged a combat that was all the more terrible in that this was a matrix from which he himself emerged, which gives this struggle an exemplary and paradoxical character. At the origin of Christian thought we have a work both illustrious and misunderstood, Augustinianism. Relegated into the shadows by official doctrine, Augustine contemplated with all the resources of Greek, Platonic and Judeo-Alexandrian philosophy, in other words, with all the still fresh memories of the Roman tradition, on the specific characteristic of Christianity, the doctrine of the fall, of sin and redemption. He interpreted the image of the mundus, of Greco-Italian origin, as a function of ordeal and purification by pain, the hole and the gap, the abyss deepening in the earthly depths, the shadowy corridor, opening to the light by a path hard to find, the trajectory of souls who return to the maternal womb of the earth to be later reborn, the mundus, a ditch in which newborn infants were abandoned when their father refused to raise them, along with the condemned to death, refuse, corpses that were not returned to the celestial fire by burning them. Nothing was more sacred, that is, more accursed, more pure and more impure, the world, an ordeal in darkness to gain redemption, light, mundus est mundus, Augustine proclaimed, at the dawn of the Christian world, the moment when the pagan world collapsed. He had found a motto for Christianity. Its slogan, Augustine, the first Westerner, did not posit in principle as something pertaining to knowledge, whether an object, like the majority of the pre-Socratics, water, fire, atoms, etc., or a subject, such as the nous for Anaxagoras, or the active intelligence for Aristotle, or again an absolute knowledge, the Platonic idea, forerunner of the Hegelian, for Augustine. Being was defined, if we may put it this way, by will and desire, not by knowledge. Being, divine, is desire and infinite, desire not inherently finished, thus inexhaustible, and desire for the infinite, for another being equally infinite. This makes possible a presentment like the sun through the clouds, of the mystery of the divine triad, the Trinity, man in the image of God, the analogue of the divine, initially as infinite desire, the fall and sin, broke this subjective infinity by separating it from its infinite object. If the world is no more than a heap of filth, reason is revealed in the rupture and finitude of desire. Fallen into the dereliction of the finite, desire seizes on finite objects but encounters there only anxiety and frustration, in place of the infinite joy that it still and always senses, rampant in the darkness of the mundus. This broken desire, divided from itself and yet reduced to pursuing only itself in self-love, this infinite desire fallen into the finite is nothing other than libido, yet not unique but triple. According to the Augustinians there are three libidines, at the same time inseparable in fallen being and yet clearly distinct. Libido scendi, curiosity, knowledge and the need for knowledge, a need always disappointed and always reborn, attracted towards each thing instead of probing its own corruption and its own failure. Libido sentienti, the concupiscence of the flesh, the need for enjoyment, the endless and always disappointed pursuit of physical pleasure, a parody of infinite love, and finally libido dominandi, ambition, the need to command and dominate, the will to power. The triple libido of the Augustinians reproduces derisorily, in the dereliction of the finite, the divine triplicity of the Father, true power, the Son, the Word, true knowledge and wisdom, and the Spirit, true love. Each libido is only the shadow of infinite desire, only desiring itself self-love, through finite objects. What relationship does this have to Nietzsche, other than purely abstract? In what way does Augustinianism, crushed by a theory of absolute knowledge, Thomism with its Aristotelian origin, which would pass through the sieve of Cartesian critique without suffering too great damage, and continue as an ingredient of Western logos, form part of the genealogy of Nietzschean thought, by way of 17th century France? The underground current of Augustinianism inspired constant protest against the official theology of the Catholic Church. It also sustained protest against the establishment of the centralized state, the absolute royal power supported by raison d'etre and knowledge. Jansenism against Louis XIV. Jansenism, however, was not confined to the thought of Cornelius Jansen, Saint Cyran, Pascal and Port Royal. It passed into literature, in Racine, and above all in La Rochefoucauld. Augustinian libido was referred to as self-love in this author's maxims, which cruelly analyze all forms of self-love to denounce its detours and masks. Ambition, the 19 search for pleasure, curiosity. La Rochefoucauld, a sophisticated duke, was well acquainted with worldly society and knew what should be known about it. He was a Jansenist by both heart and spirit. This moralist destroyed the social world, le monde, the court, courtiers, royal power, to official knowledge, the Cartesian, state logos. He opposed the asceticism of a non-knowledge full of bitter clarity. Nietzsche both read and reflected on Larouche Foucault's maxims. Not only did he know them but he imitated them. The aphorisms of human, all too human, extend to the modern age. The harsh analysis, intrepid penetration and sad knowledge of the French moralist, who might be more properly called an immoralist. They have the same frame of mind, the same pointedness and alacrity. If Nietzsche revealed the libido dominandi, self-love as ambition and struggle for power, it was to denounce it down to its roots. The Protestantism of this son of a pastor drew nourishment and strength from a Jansenism diverted from its aim and its meaning, and soon turned in protest against those who destroy the world but do not know what to do with the debris. So much for the sad science. As for the gay science, it has a close origin and a, dialectically, 20 opposite meaning. Outside of Greco-Roman logos, logic and law, and Judeo-Christian morality, the hatred of pleasure, enjoyment viewed as sin and defilement. What did the West invent? A madness that gives meaning to actions and things. Individual love, mad love, absolute love. But the West misunderstood, ignored and crushed the best that it had. Southern French civilization, that of the Median king's son, which assimilated images, metaphors and concepts from the Arabs of Andalusia as well as from Celtic 21 legends, brought courtship into love, which did not just mean respect for the beloved being, the individual, the person, escaping the ancient status of beautiful object, but the sharing of pleasure. The gay science was not simply a rhetoric of love, or a way of assembling words. It was the art of living in and through love, the art of joy and amorous pleasure. The lover, in the act of love, honors his lady. He serves her instead of using her for his sexual need. Respect for the beloved being, the beautiful woman, not only meant refusing to consider her as an object, not only submitting to her will and even her caprices, but also giving her control of physical pleasure. Courtly and absolute love proclaimed itself above ambition and power, beyond the will to power. The libido sentienti was redeemed, purified by passion. Desire was once again infinite, as it no longer had a finite object before it but a divine being. Deus in terris, beautiful, active, sentient and conscious. The gay science supersedes sin and redemption. It rediscovers the innocence of the body and great health. It contains a deeper understanding, connaissance, than the bitterness of critical analysis, and truer than the pure knowledge of the learned. Better than work, and more than knowledge. It gives meaning and value to events, actions, things. It is a constant festival. Nietzsche brought together gay science and bitter science, superseding the one with the other. 22 Subordinating lucidity to joy without losing it, and likewise knowing, conator, to living. From their conflictual unity he sought a third term that he believed would arise, a poetic life of the flesh to transcend both the sad science and the gay science. Living and lived experience forcefully reassert themselves, with violence if need be. Against whom and against what? Against the coldest of cold monsters, the state. Against sad, conceptual, knowledge. Against oppressive and repressive violence. Against the everyday, against unacceptable reality. Against labor and the division of labor and the production of things. Against social morality and constraints, those of a society without civilization that seeks to perpetuate itself by any means. Around 1885, shortly after Marx had died, Nietzsche the poet, Nietzsche the megalomaniac, cried out his anguish and his joy. He wanted to save the world and Europe from the barbarism they were falling into. Western society, that of logos I Greco-Roman, logic and law, and morality, Judeo-Christian, Puritanism, had become monstrous beyond belief, beyond all measure. Production for destruction, making children for wars, accumulating knowledge to dominate peoples. Nietzsche saw these absurdities in Germany under the sign of reason. He sensed, denounced and stigmatized the fundamental error, philosophically consecrated and legitimized by Hegel, the conjunction and fusion of knowledge and authority, abstract cognition and power, in the state, and the state model of modern society. Today, he would see the destruction of nature both outside and within man, as a manifestation of the will to power in all its horror, rather than its negation, and the same with the potential self-destruction of the human species, nuclear danger, etc. The West had tried out its values, in an immense assertion, logic, law, state, Hegel, work and production, Marx. The result tended to prove the failure of the human race. The reverse and counterpart of this colossal assertion was a hidden nihilism and a malevolence pertaining to pathology. European nihilism was not the product of critical thought, but of its ineffectiveness. It did not come from the rejection of history, nation, homeland, but from the defeats of history. Its secret, its enigma, they lie in the assertion itself, that of logos, an assertion that appears full yet reveals its emptiness. Did Nietzsche ignore work, industry, the working class, capitalism and the bourgeoisie? He speaks little of these directly. He speaks of them only through the critique of culture and knowledge. If he dismisses them from his field, it is because in his view none of these terms, none of these realities, contributes a perspective other than nihilistic. Where Hegelianism has seen the triumph of reason, where Marx saw the conditions of a different society, Nietzsche perceived only a reality that he did not strive to recognize at such, except to refute and reject it, for it would tumble into mud and blood. Should Nietzsche be defined as anarchistic? Yes and no. Yes, as he rejects en bloc the real and knowledge of the real considered as high reality. Yes, as with him subversion is distinguished from revolution. No, as he has nothing in common with Stirner or Bakunin, who define themselves by a consciousness, a knowledge, not political in the case of the former, basically political with the latter. Anarchists remain on the ground of the real, of what and whom they combat. They want to see and possess a property, albeit unique, or expropriate those who possess reality. Nietzsche wanted to supersede the real, transcend it by poetry, appealing to carnal depths. Did he struggle for the oppressed? No. According to him, the oppressed have often, if not always, lived better, in other words, more intensely, more ardently, than their oppressors. They sang, they danced, they cried out their pain and their fury, even when subject to the values of their conquerors. In their own way, they invented what? Not what would bring down their masters and overturn the situation, but something else, closer to Dionysus, god and myth of the earth, of the vanquished, of the oppressed, women, slaves, peasants, etc. For Nietzsche there is thus an inaugural act, redemption, supersession, renouncing the will to power after having experienced it, thus renouncing the political acts by which oppression and exploitation are maintained. This is how the initial act is placed in perspective. Will to live? This remains derisory if one, the subject, sticks to an intuition, an intention which dismisses voluntarist and vitalist philosophy. Schopenhauer, Stirner and many others, Classical tragedy marked the place of redemption. It repeated the sacrifice of the hero to show how his fate is accomplished and what leads him to his loss. It redeemed the spectator actor from the obscure wish expressed in wanting power. As a popular festival, it opened up new possibilities. In Greece, urban life and rational law supplanted custom. Music offers the example of an ever-prodigious metamorphosis, transforming anguish and desire into joy. In the course of a purification deeper than Aristotelian catharsis, it creates meaning. The subject. This preoccupation of the philosophers proves derisory. There is no other subject than the body, but the body has its depth, and music is born from it and returns to it, with its sounds more luminous than light that speaks only to the gaze. On the basis of this exaltation of art, myths and religions are to be interpreted instead of falling into derision. Superstition. Myths and religions sought redemption, but missed the real aim as they served as masks for the will to power, generating practices, rites, and institutions, churches. If religions are understood and interpreted, the causes of decadence are found in them, particularly in the West where Judeo-Christianity generated capitalism and the bourgeoisie, phenomena that were derivative but that aggravated their causes. Nietzschean overcoming, Überwinden, differs radically from Hegelian and Marxian Lefebvre. It does not preserve anything. It does not carry its antecedents and preconditions to a higher level. It casts them into nothingness. Subversive rather than revolutionary, Überwinden overcomes by destroying, or rather by leading to itself, destruction that which it replaces. This is how Nietzsche sought to overcome both the European assertion of logos and its opposite obverse side, nihilism. Is it necessary to add that this heroic struggle against Judeo-Christian nihilism on behalf of and through carnal life has nothing in common with hedonism? There is a triad, 3 terms, but in the course of the struggle what is born casts the other terms into nothingness, sends them Zugrund, as Heidegger would say, with the result that they then appear as foundations, depths, dialectical, yes, but radically different from either the Hegelian or the Marxist dialectic, by the role, the import, the meaning of the negative, by the intensity of the tragic doubt the superhuman. This is born therefore from the destruction and self-destruction of all that exists under the name of human. It is the possible impossible par excellence, as already implied by the initial and initiating redemption, rejection of the will to power, the gay. Science enjoys pessimism, as for what should be, sullen. This is an imperative of living rather than morality, a distant possibility, no, so close to everyone that nothing is able to grasp it. The superhuman resides in the body. Cf. what Zarathustra says of those who have contempt for the body. This body, rich in unknown virtualities, unfurls some of its powers in art, the eye in the gaze in painting, touch in sculpture, the ear in music, speech in language and poetry. The total body, in a conjuncture that favors it, is unfurled in theatre and architecture, music and dance. If this total body deploys all its possibilities, then the superhuman penetrates into the real by metamorphosing it, as in poetry and music, not without certain ordeals, such as the terrifying idea of eternal recurrence, the reproduction of the past, absolute repetition or the absolute of repetition, chance and necessity dizzily united. 7. Do we now, in the second half of the 20th century, possess all the elements of a vast confrontation, all the pieces of a great trial in which all that remains is to denote accusers and accused, witnesses, judges, lawyers? No, the files are incomplete, by a long way, if we examine the great visions or conceptions of the world, understanding by this, in rather imprecise way, theologies and theogonies, theosophies, theodicies, metaphysics and philosophies, representations and ideologies, we perceive that they put to work a small number of principles, 1, 23, 2 or 3, rarely more. The sacred numbers include 7, 10, 12 and 13. Philosophico-metaphysical principles are limited to the one, the double, and the triad. Do the most vigorously and rigorously unitary conceptions have their birthplace in the East? Very likely. Hegel already thought this in his philosophy of 24 history. Are there preconditions revealed by an Asiatic mode of production, incompletely defined by Marx, which according to him differed from the Western modes of production in terms of the role of the state, cities and the sovereign, as well as in its social base, stable agricultural communities, with the result that the entire mental and social space, agricultural and urban, was organized according to a single law, whatever the case, immanent, in nature, the palpable, or transcendent, being or spirit. The one asserts itself as absolute principle in several conceptions of the world. Many others accept 2 principles, generally in struggle, the male and female principles, or goodness and evil, good people and bad, light and darkness. These dualist, binary, conceptions received their most elaborate expression in Manichaeism. Almost everywhere they draw on the magical and ritual content of popular religion. The Mediterranean basin and the Middle East seem to have been the birthplaces of this dualism, or at least its places of predilection. Is its precondition the conflictual relationship between sea and land, plain and mountain, the settled and the nomadic? Perhaps, but it does not matter. Here we shall emphasize the differences between conceptions of the world, leaving aside their history. The European West seems committed to triadic or trinitarian thought, and from a very early date, if we believe the research of prehistorians and anthropologists, as early as the establishment of a stable agriculture and settled villages, with the great migrations that unfurled across Europe for many centuries. The Greeks already thought in triads, chance, will, determinism. It was in the West that the Christian doctrine of the Trinity took shape, shedding unitary and dualist doctrines, respectively monophysitism and Manichaeism, the latter still being influential in the Middle Ages, as with the Cathars. Why? In what conditions? Perhaps because of the triadic structure of agrarian communities, houses and gardens, arable land in private ownership, pasture and forest in collective possession, or perhaps due to the process of their origin, the formation of towns on an already developed agricultural basis, so that the town appeared as a higher unity, combining villages and hamlets, familiar places with those distant and thereby foreign. Or again, did this threefold model have its origin in Euclidean geometry and the theory of three-dimensional space, though it seems to pre-exist this, and to develop outside of science. Why not look for the reasons and causes of the dominant representations in social or mental space? We only raise this question here in 25 passing. An underground current runs through Christianity, deeper and more hidden than Augustinianism, because it's more heretical. It could be compared with a water table that irrigates the roots of trees, surfaces in springs and fills wells. Joachim de Fleur's eternal gospel very probably owes its form to Abelard as much as to its attributed author. Removed from their mysterious and mystical substantiality, their eternity, they form part of reality and historicity. The Father, this is nature and its wonders, the infinite and terrible fertile power in which are dimly discerned creation and the created, consciousness and unconsciousness, suffering and pleasure, life and death. Hardship is not added to natural existence, it is inherent to it. The Son, the Word, is not eternally coextensive with the paternal substance but emerges from it, is born from it in time, language, consciousness, cognition, coincide with the birth and growth of the Son. In the course of his rise, knowledge cannot fail to acquire self-confidence. This faith goes hand in hand with consciousness and its troubled certainty, conquered over doubt. The Word believed it would save the world. It failed. Knowledge is not enough for redemption, neither is the suffering of the unhappy consciousness. Not only did Christ, the Word, die in vain, but his death enabled the worst of powers to establish itself, the church that celebrates the death of the Word by killing it each day, killing thought, in order for redemption to be accomplished. The Spirit, the third term of the triad, a triad eternal and temporal, immanent and transcendent, has to be embodied and turn the world upside down. The Spirit is subversive or is nothing. It is embodied in heretics, rebels, the pure who struggle against impurity. It brings with it revolt and joy. Only the Spirit is life and light. Joachim's eternal gospel divides time into three periods: the law, faith and joy. The law belongs to the Father and comes from him. The harsh law of nature and the power that extends this. Faith belongs to the Word, the Son, with its corollaries of hope and charity. The Spirit brings joy, presence and communication, absolute love and perfect light, but also struggle, adventure, subversion, thus violence against violence, misunderstood by the customary history of philosophy, as by that of society. This triadic schema had an inestimable import. We should note that it has, as a schema of reality and model of thought, far greater flexibility than a binary or unitary one. It contains rhythms. It corresponds to processes. It cuts across Cartesian thought, in which the divine infinite embraces the two modes of existence of the finite, extension and thought. It triumphs in Hegel. What is Hegelianism? An interweaving of triads, emitted and recaptured by the third higher term, the idea, the spirit. First triad, nature, history, concept. Second triad, implicit and explanatory, thesis or assertion, negation or antithesis, synthesis or positive, affirmative, supersession. Third triad, need, work, enjoyment, or rather, satisfaction. Fourth, the master, the slave, the victory of the slave over the master, a victory that transforms him into the master's superior, superseding him. Fifth, prehistory, history, post-history and so on. As for Marx, his triadic schema modifies but preserves the Hegelian schema, taking it, according to Marx and Engels, to a higher level: affirmation, negation, negation of the negation, which accentuates the role 26 of the negative. The developed communism of the future restores primitive communism but with the full wealth of development. Private property of the means of production supplanted the collective possession of these means. The land, it will give way to a social possession and management, hence collectives and automatic machines. Even Marx presents a bourgeois holy trinity: capital, land, labor, profit, rent, wages, and so on. Oddly enough, the positivism that opposed any philosophical speculation adopted the triadic schema, according to Auguste Comte and his famous law of three stages. The metaphysical age followed on from the theological age, and the scientific age will replace it. As for Nietzsche, if we accept that he identifies himself with his spokesman Zarathustra, he also adopts the triadic schema. Three metamorphoses of the spirit do I designate to you: how the spirit becomes a camel, the camel a lion, and the lion at last a child. The camel demands the heaviest task, the most onerous law. The lion seeks to win its freedom and assert itself, by finding itself, by becoming capable of creating. It has faith in itself and in its future. The child is innocent and forgotten, a beginning, a game, a self-rolling wheel, joy. Zarathustra said this while staying in a town called the Pied Cow. Did Nietzsche have in mind the quest for the Grail, the Absolute, and Parsifal, whose story tells of his youth, purity and even simplicity of spirit? After Merlin, divine diabolical, and Lancelot, man and superhuman, comes the spirit child. Why not apply to our own triad? Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche the same triadic model? Hegel would be the father, the law; Marx, the son and faith; Nietzsche, the spirit and joy. Such an application does not hide its parodic intention. Why this reflection or retrospection on triads? Because nothing guarantees the eternity of this model. Will it not also suffer obsolescence, exhaust itself? Should we today, after detailed examination of the triads, not reject this schema and supersede it, either by Lefebvre or by Uberwinden, or else leave it only a share, perhaps the sacred or cursed share, of our reality or our understanding? Does this appreciation, also for the moment at the stage of a tactical hypothesis, lead to a return, recourse to the substantialist, absolute unity or binary model, formal oppositions, non-dialectical contrasts and dualities? This is neither obvious nor probable. More likely we shall have to adopt a different route, an approach that takes account of a greater number of moments and elements, levels and dimensions. In brief, a multidimensional thought. Will this maintain, in contrast, that thought, by taking account of greater numbers, loses itself in too great a number of parameters, variables, dimensions and flows? Not necessarily. 8. The ensemble of categorical assertions posited by Western logos is surrounded by a network of problems. Among these, that of cognition emerges and deepens. Abyss and mountain. Philosophy raised it in the late 18th century, and from then on it formed part of the theoretical situation in Europe. Previously, in Cartesian thought, in the critical project associated with the encyclopedia that arose in France, and in the empiricism and positive science that emerged in England, no doubt appeared as far as knowledge was concerned, the critique of religion and the political. regime was pursued in the name of cognition. Logos was questioned but was not itself put in question. The scene changed with Kant's critical philosophy. What is it to know? Worst secacanator. L. This simple question ravaged questioning thought. From this time, it would pursue its path no longer by seeking the absolute, the mythic grail, but instead the answer to the question of understanding. The horizon changed. This ravaged thought would hesitate between rationalism and classical humanism, a humanism that received its formulation from Goethe, and romanticism, itself dual, either reactive or revolutionary. Unfortunately, philosophy and professional philosophers restricted the problematic understanding to make it more precise, so that it would belong to their discipline, which was tending to become a speciality. They saw science as an incontestable process, an activity both sufficient and necessary, a reduction that reduced philosophy to epistemology, a meticulous sorting between acquired knowledge and uncertain representations. From Kant on, philosophy put the problem of understanding as follows: where are the limits of knowledge, either provisional or definitive? How can these markers be crossed? How can we know, later, more and better, more knowledge and more certain knowledge? Philosophy like this sidesteps the wider problem, the real question of understanding. Knowledge is necessary, but is it sufficient one? What is cognition worth? Not in terms of results, conceptions, methods, theories, but as activity? Various responses were immediately proposed. The sufficiency of knowledge was countered by the notion of a necessary and insufficient knowledge, and that of a necessary non-knowledge. Cognition was referred beyond or below itself, to intuition, learned ignorance, or pure and simple faith. Who formulated the problematic of understanding in its full scope? Goethe, not in Werther or Wilhelm 27 Meister, but in Faust. In other words, a tragic play rather than a novel. This play, hardly stageable, particularly the second part, opposes living to cognition. Faust, who knows all that could be known in his day, belatedly perceives that he has failed to live. For his happiness and unhappiness, he is visited by the demonic principle, the absolute other, the accursed of God, who knows what Faust does not know, who possesses the secret of living, passion, delirium, madness, crime, in a word, evil sin. Mephistopheles, with the authorization of his hierarchical superior, the eternal father, allows Faust to pass through the ordeals of living after having undergone those of knowing. He leads him to Gretchen, the woman still passive, beauty, the beautiful object, but able to suffer and complain, and then to Helen, the active woman, still more lovely, but more ungraspable. The old triptych God-man-devil is joined by a fourth character, woman. She differs equally from the eternal virgin and the eternal mother. She is duplicated, victim and servant of sensual pleasure Gretchen, queen of beauty, joy and delight Helen. The eternal feminine is revealed only by way of initiation and ordeal. To the great question that opens like an abyss on the path of modern man, Goethe gives only a poetic response. All that happens is only symbol, hieroglyph, and only the eternal feminine calls and shows the way of redemption. This is how the great Western idea pursues its course, that of absolute love as a counterpoint to logos. This great image runs right through the West, from the medieval romances down to Legrand Moulins, where it dissolves in the pallid moonlight of the beautiful soul, unless it rebounds dart still in Goethe's lifetime. Hegel divinized knowledge. For him, the negative places itself in the service of positivity, absolute knowledge, and we could interpret the demonic in Goethe Mephistopheles as an accentuation of the negative, given that its role remains ambiguous. For Hegel, then, God is the concept is identified with divinity. The concept of history and the history of the concept coincide. From nature emerges logos, the word, then nature and word, science and consciousness, language and logic unite in the recovered spirit, absolute spirit. God, knowledge and history converge in the state, absolute spirit. Logos as principle and end, is ultimately defined as a philosophical trinity, concept, father, becoming, son, state, spirit. And Kierkegaard was not wrong to rail sarcastically at the speculative Good Friday by which the God in three persons incarnated in history climbed the Golgotha of dialectical ordeals to reach the glory of the last judgment, as pronounced by the philosopher. With Hegel dead, Hegelianism disintegrated. What a strange situation European thought found itself in after Hegel and Goethe, after Kant and Schopenhauer. At first with the young Hegelians, then after them, Marx hesitated between knowing and acting. He retained the project of constructing an imprescriptible knowledge, resistant to all refutation and reaching the essence of society, bourgeois, capitalist, but he took up the Promethean Faustian formula. In the beginning was the deed. He maintained the Hegelian ideas of rationality underlying history, a philosophico-scientific certitude inherent to the analysis of practice, a finality subordinating causality and necessity. At the same time, he hesitated before the rationality that in this schema was immanent to existing society and reality. How long would the bourgeoisie survive? Would it exhaust its inherent rationality? Did this reason itself have to be broken, along with the state and property relations? Would the bourgeoisie continue its historic mission for a long time? The growth of the productive forces until the inevitable qualitative leap? Where were the internal limits of capitalism? If there is a rationality everywhere, it is also to be found in this society, which is easily qualified as absurd on the grounds of its injustice and inhumanity. Marx posited a meaning of becoming, of history, without demonstrating it. He accepted Hegelian, Western, logos without subjecting it to a fundamental critique. Hegel's still theological hypothesis passed through the sieve, the break, in Marx's thought. No more than Hegel did Marx question the origin of Western rationality, its genesis or genealogy, Judeo-Christianity, Greco-Latin thought, industry and technology. Marx was content with an attenuation of Hegelian theology, theodicy, and the epic of the idea. Sometimes Marx and Engels came up against some conceptions that were irreducible to their schematization. For example, logic and law. Why had logic born in Greece, continued across the Western societies and their modes of production? What relationship was there between ideologies and the dialectic? As for law, elaborated in Rome, this lasted until its renaissance in the bourgeois democratic revolution, with the Napoleonic Code Civil. Accordingly, the social transition to communism would not be able to do without law and laws, with the result that the triadic schema from unconscious customs under primitive communism, through law in the course of history, to conscious custom within developed communism, remains abstract. Equally, Marx was unable to say much about the future communist society, other than that the long transition would be punctuated by ends: end of capitalism by revolution, end of labor by automation, end of law by custom, end of state, nation, homeland, working class, bourgeoisie, a separate economy and a dominant polity, etc. Nietzsche would add to this list, the death of God and man. One question arises when thought reflects on this path signposted by ends and deaths, as a set of wreaths are signaled by crosses and shipwrecks. Will not logos itself come to an end, exhausted, passed into writing and writings, even writing itself, born as it was from living speech and word? If Hegel maintained with incomparable vigor and intolerable rigor the primacy of knowledge as code of the real, hence the primacy of theory, system, concept, thus doing away with rifts, separations, splits and conflicts, Marx already hesitated between cognition, partially transferred to production, and creative action, practical living and experience, the key preoccupation of the famous 1844 manuscripts. With Marx, the productive activity intended to assure doctrinal unity divides into a. Production, manufacture, of material things, exchangeable goods, commodities, machines, in other words, means of production. B. Production of social relations, creation of artworks, ideas, institutions, cognitions, connaissances, language, aesthetic objects, innovative acts. While Hegel had successfully attempted a unitary concept in the narrow context of knowledge, Marx failed in the wider framework of action. Production and creation fell apart, despite his efforts to combine them, each threatening to go its own way. 9. This is how avant-garde European thought led towards what we can retrospectively call the Nietzschean crisis. The problem of understanding had received no solution. The revolution failed in 1848 and again in 1871. What was the outcome of the rationality that Hegel had seen as imminent in the state, and Marx in social, industrial, practice, wars? At the same moment as Nietzsche, and for quite similar reasons, Rambo declared that it was life that had to be changed, and love reinvented. But the proud edifice of Hegelianism bridled, outdoing in arrogance and power the Bonapartist state that had issued from the great French Revolution. Bismarck, a political strategist with great vision, understood that certain objectives of the democratic revolution could be realized from above, by consolidating the state instead of transforming it national unity. For example, he also envisaged integrating into the national state the new class that was in the course of formation, the proletariat. From this point, Germany, which had brought the modern world philosophy, committed itself to the most pedantic historiographic erudition, to Philistinism. It threatened to conquer Europe, initially through a culture that denied civilization. The recourse to myth. Wagner showed this decadence of Western logos, with its two aspects that were seemingly incompatible but actually mutually supporting, knowledge and power. A descent into hell began, starting with descent into the abyss of consciousness, psychism, the unconscious, will and desire, with Schopenhauer, a vain fascination, as Nietzsche said, and show shameless and unheeding logos, proud of its accumulated knowledge and methods, conveyed some myth of its own. The first among these, in the name of which it exerted its worst blackmail, was irrationality. Any criticism of reason would lead to unreason and an apology for violence, whereas it is logos itself that has cruelty as its obverse side, its counterpart and counterpoint, whereas the appeal from conceptual knowledge to a higher form of understanding has a meaning and must be heard. Yet Nietzsche did not exhaust the list of myths, manipulations and blackmails bound up with the exercise of logos, power and cognition. He could not have known them all in his day, and some of them might have turned against him. The myth of the Titan, the modern Prometheus who breaks the great social and political machine, a myth that exalted the modern working class, Nietzsche took up in his own way when he sought to philosophize with a hammer. Similarly, with the opposite and corollary myth of the clever little imp who somewhere disrupts a little cog in the same machine, so that it comes to a 28 halt and stops functioning. The forces of negation, protest, contestation, are themselves dislocated. But this remark leads on to a different story. 10. To continue the confrontation between the members of the Hegel-Marx-Nietzsche triad, in other words, between the three dominant thoughts on the modernity that they each sought to grasp, we have to do away with political encumbrances and hypotheses. 29. This point deserves close attention. Hegel and Hegelianism may be charged with reaction pure and simple. A rightist politics that saw itself not just as realpolitik but as theoretically true, would be justified in Hegel by analysis of the real, of the nation and the pays real, the necessary institutions. This would also legitimate both state and state apparatuses, along with political apparatuses in general and the predominance of the statesman over all other moments of knowledge, culture, etc. Now, there is this in Hegel, theorization and rationalization of the political act. There is it in the justification, along with the state, of the state of things, in which the totality of the real comes to a halt, stagnates and is blocked. If there was only this in Hegel, would he merit the present confrontation? Would there be ground and cause for a hearing? No. First of all, Hegelianism contains, together with the theorization, the confession and denunciation of this state of things. It makes possible an analysis. Second, Hegel, who sought to be and believed himself a defender of freedom, also rejected and rebutted this extreme case, stagnation, the display of the accomplished. He conceived a compromise that would bring harmony between authority and freedom. Only the liberal state left room for its moments and for the flexibility of its members. It alone was able to regenerate itself, reproduce itself with an inherent dynamism, a vitality both immanent and rational. For Hegel, obsolescent recourse to fait accompli, to unrestrained violence, indicated that the final equilibrium had not been achieved. It was either incomplete or had failed. If, in the last century and a half, the state has revealed its worst side, which Hegel had theorized, we cannot make Hegel's doctrine responsible, a symptom more than a cause or a reason. Hegelianism cannot be got rid of as easily as something like the legal historicism of Savigny. For example, it can be used, and certainly has been, to justify sticking to the past, in terms of historicism, nationalism, even chauvinism. These interpretations and alterations are part of the file, but they do not prevent us compiling this. B. The same is true of Stalinism for Marx. If there is a revisionist ideology in relation to Marx's thought, it is certainly this dark cloud. True, the Stalinist mystifiers launched the revisionist epithet to cover up their own ideological operations, based, it goes without saying, on the economic, social and political reality of the USSR after Lenin. The Stalinists cleverly muddied their tracks, for example by describing Hegel as a philosopher of feudal reaction, whereas they themselves were Hegelians and even super-Hegelians. If the class struggle after a proletarian revolution leads to a strengthening and increased centralization of the state, this may be a historical necessity, but it has nothing in common with the thinking of Marx. Still more, if this thesis is true in the theoretical sense of the term, then so-called Marxist thought collapses. It crumbles into pieces, even if well-intentioned people gather up the pieces and try to reconstruct something with the debris. Against this pseudo-theory we can cite so many texts by Marx, Engels and Lenin that they would fill volumes. Moreover, the violent controversies aroused by Stalinism and the anti-Stalinist opposition have revealed a contradiction internal to the revolutionary movement and the workers' movement itself. This already appeared with Saint Simon and Fourier. The latter was happy to dispense with the state, whereas Saint Simon no less happily contradicted himself, at one point demanding a state that would be effective because run by the industrials, producers and scientists, elsewhere the replacement of state constrained by the direct administration of things. This contradiction erupted in Europe around the year 1870, when political historians and publicists tenderly examined the workers' movement, with a view to eliminating or at least attenuating its contradictions. They overlooked the double process that led in France to the Commune and in Germany to the Social Democratic Party. The French movement resolutely attacked the state and demolished it in 1870, when the workers of Paris set out to storm the heavens. German socialism, in contrast, influenced by the Hegelian Lassalle, accepted and integrated the state, an integration which, as we know, was envisaged by the great political strategist Bismarck. Do we need to recall once again the content of Marx's critique of the Gotha program, in which, despite a cautious formulation that hardly mentions the Paris Commune, Marx's full approval of this is clear enough. In what was his political testament, the contradiction is manifest even in the thought and work of Marx. Hence the terrible bitterness of the last line of this text. Dixi et salvavi animam meme. I have spoken and saved my soul. If state socialism has triumphed in the workers' movement, and in the world, this means that the workers' movement has abandoned both Marxism and Leninism, that it has succumbed to a Stalinism, that Marxism has become an ideology, a philosophy serving the state, a public service in the Hegelian sense. Marx holds no responsibility for this situation, other than having left in obscurity a conflict of decisive importance. C. The same holds, finally, for Nietzsche and Hitlerian fascism. A forced falsification twisted Nietzsche's texts, pulling them towards fascist ideology. True, ambiguous fragments are not lacking. In his analysis of the will to power, Nietzsche expresses admiration for questionable heroes, adventurers, condottieri, conquistadores. Marx might equally be classified as an anti-Semite on the basis of his text on the Jewish question, developing a radical critique, a fundamental refutation, a refusal and rejection of the libido dominandi. Nietzsche envisaged all its aspects, all its masks, both political and otherwise, imperial and imperialist action, Machiavellianism, warlike ambition and activity, as well as goodness, charitable action, good works, even renunciation and humility. As for Nietzsche's success, in other words, the reception of his theoretical analysis as ideology, this underwent a change of sign. Anarchists and immoralists at the turn of the 20th century, then fascist politicians, and today philosophers, so-called Nietzscheans, have all contributed to his misunderstanding. These errors of interpretation have to figure in the file. They are not directly imputable to the author. This rejection of political appreciation implies a devaluing of politics as such, something we should emphasize. The political criterion, which during the Stalinist and fascist period was presented as absolute, is in no way definitive. It changes and falls for a short space of time. It took on a total appearance because imposed by the double means of ideological persuasion and violence. It then induced errors whose derisory character was later apparent. 11. Is it out of a mania for triads, or a caricature of the supposedly triadic model, that you focus here on just three bodies of work, three thinkers? What leads you to place Hegel, Marx and Nietzsche at the gateway to modernity and as its guiding lights? Why not others? One, it is free for anyone to claim that shadows and the realm of shadows came to an end with Freud, Heidegger, Lenin or Mao Zedong, or even Wilhelm Reich, Georges Bataille, etc. Let us look at Freud and his work. Why not include him here, and place him in the dominant constellation? Freud's thought and his psychoanalysis acquired much of their strength from being connected with clinical observation, with a therapeutic practice, often effective, but sometimes in vain or even worse. This medical practice has a real existence. It is a real game at broad sexuality, so long a blinkered zone, into language and conceptual thought. As for practice, the connection of Marxist thought and revolutionary practice, attempts, defeats, gives it a good position to reply to practicists. Only Nietzschean thought suffers from the comparison, being linked only to a practice of speech, unless it is placed in relationship with the mediocre practice of writing. Psychoanalysis, for its part, led to a trade, a profession with its place in the social division of labor, and tending from the start towards institutionalization. In such a situation, partial, clinical, practice gave birth to an ideology that seeks to justify it by overstepping it. By tackling every problem, it seeks to be total. Hence the weakness of psychoanalysis, a formless mixture of a linguistic technique with fragmentary cognitions, connaissances, and with representations proclaimed beyond their sphere of validity, by reduction and extrapolation. This ideology conveys its own myth, the unconscious, a box of tricks that contains everything put into it: body, memory, individual and social history, language, culture and its result or residues, etc. Finally, and above all, Freud only grasped, described and analyzed the libido sentienti. Psychoanalysis after Freud only indirectly tackled the libido dominandi, so profoundly explored by Nietzsche. It completely neglected the libido scendi, the domain of cognition, the social status of knowledge. Why not? Because Freud, though influenced by Schopenhauer's deep-going studies, never abandoned the Hegelian schema of knowledge. He thus failed to recognize the great underground tradition, the clandestine legacy that made for the greatness of European thought and through which the dead or rotten branches of logos were given new life. Psychoanalysis does not go as far in its analysis as had Augustine, Janssen, Foucault, Pascal and Nietzsche, when Freud had to face the terrible discovery that sex and sexuality led only to failure, drama and pathos, thus the pathological. He took up the very old theme of concordia discus or discordis conquers, adding very little to this besides the clinical efforts to cure neuroses. Do psychoanalysts succeed in this? Do they control the terrible negative power of language, by means of language? That is a different matter. If understanding perceives desire at the lowest depth of being, it puts in question understanding itself. For Nietzsche, who pursued this line of questioning to its end, the great desire whose potential energy was hidden in the total body and not in sex alone, this great desire that becomes supreme grandeur, born from the body and in the body, reveals itself as dance, song, then desire for eternity, eternal itself. It has nothing in common with the poor sexual libido, nor even with platonic eros. Men are we saint sucked, says Zarathustra, my wise yearning, wisdom embraced, desire across the mountains, desire on trembling wings. This ardent reason shouts and laughs. In the investigation pursued here, it would be interesting to study the movements that shake religions and religious institutions, in particular the Catholic Church, rather than psychoanalysis, a modernist ideology that is somewhat arrogant. Would not Nietzsche himself have seen the success of psychoanalysis as a further symptom of decadence, an aggravated sickness, a form of European nihilism? Certainly, there is something morbid about this new avatar of Judeo-Christianity, which seeks to recycle itself by making up for the curse cast on sex, but preserves in its language and concepts all the signs of non-body. Psychoanalysis, as theory and ideology, practice and technique, of discourse, has succeeded neither in restoring the total body nor in preventing the phallic from assuming an object existence. Besides, the ideological breakthrough of psychoanalysis continues to obscure Nietzschean thought by relegating it to a blind zone that replaces another blind zone, that of sex, a zone that is nothing other than the libido dominandi. As a result, psychoanalysis as ideology serves the established order in a number of ways, by hindering the critique of the state and power, by displacing thought and substituting another center, etc. Why not Heidegger? I questioning voice demands, rather malevolently, for several reasons. This philosopher does not figure in the constellation here. He followed the triadic model in the most naive manner, being, its eclipse, its resurrection or resurgence. This history of being, the creative power, the word, the spirit, was seen as original by people unaware of Joachim de Fleur's eternal gospel. It obscured the more concrete history offered by Hegel and Marx, without attaining the force of Nietzsche's critique of history. Heidegger's philosophy, dissimulated theodicy, hardly secularized, tends to rescue the philosophical tradition without passing it through the sieve of radical criticism. Heidegger eludes the notion of metaphilosophy despite touching on it. He substitutes for it an ontology said to be fundamental, a variant of metaphysics whether we like it or not. True, he makes a contribution to the critical analysis of modernity, being one of the first to have perceived and foreseen the ravages of technology and understood that domination over nature, by means of knowledge and technique, becomes domination over people, and does not coincide with appropriation of this nature, which it tends to destroy. Heidegger speaks, writes, an admirable language, almost too fine. As for him the dwelling of being what saves it from endless wandering is language, the word, and constructions, architecture, temples, palaces, monuments and buildings. From this admirable idea, we use the word ironically, the philosopher draws a disturbing apology for the German language. This prevents him from a radical critique of Western, European logos. Despite bordering on this, what he says of Nietzsche and against Nietzsche does not convince that Nietzsche went too far and too deep, that he followed the mirroring surfaces of consciousness, veridical and deceptive, any better than his predecessor. As for other contemporary thinkers, what have they done except launch into circulation the small change of Hegel, Marx and Nietzsche along with some counterfeit coins? 31 This judgment may seem severe. Actually, there is nothing pejorative about it. It simply means that theoretical struggles and ideological tests do not pass without harm. 12. The same voice is raised again. You only include German thinkers. Are you not concerned at privileging unduly a particular culture and language? And by what right do you refuse Heidegger what he dares to demand? Precisely this privilege one. Marx gave a peremptory reply to this argument in outlining the course of his own reflection and that of Hegelian thought. Because of Germany's economic and political backwardness in the first half of the 19th century, German thought kept a distance that enabled its philosophers to understand what was happening in England, economic growth, capitalism, the bourgeoisie, and France, the political revolution, the formation of the nation-state with Robespierre and Napoleon. The great Germans were able to bring to language and to the concept what was happening and being done elsewhere. In uneven development, the bad side, sometimes, has its productive counterpart. This privilege of distance came to an end with the economic and political rise of Germany, as Nietzsche saw very well in 1873. With his untimely meditations, Marx, who continued in a conflictual relationship with the great German tradition, had already left his homeland, which was only able to view him by way of a crucial misunderstanding. Lassalleanism, state socialism, the fetishism of the state. Where is the sharpest critique of Germany to be found? In the works of Marx and Nietzsche. They spoke as connoisseurs, Nietzsche being inspired more than Marx by French thought, not the official Cartesian tradition but the underground currents. Marx, as we know, received his main impulse from the great English writers Smith and Ricardo. As for France, why not boldly recognize the turn taken by French thought after Saint-Simon and Fourier? Cartesian rationalism was weakening, but it resisted and put up a counterattack. We know all too well that this dethroned universalism threw off its grafts. dialectic, radical criticism and self-criticism, etc. In a chauvinistic nationalism, it swung between apologetic affirmation of Western logos confounded for the needs of the cause with Cartesian rationalism and indeterminate negation, with recourse to ruthlessness, good or bad, and to barbarism. With this conversion of what was said elsewhere, the repeated affirmation of logos has made possible a recuperation of attempts at emancipation by economism or the national state, as for subversive negation, indeterminate, anarchistic and destructive of knowledge without replacing it. This has led to a recuperation by literature, philosophy and ideology, including institutionalized 32 psychoanalysis. For nearly a century and a half now, theoretical thought in France has remained below its theoretical possibilities, below political practice and events. The revolutions of 1848, 1871 and 1968. These political events already go beyond, supersede both reality and political reflection. Thought in France dwells on illusory brilliance, diversions that led it only into a siding. Marx had already noted this backwardness, due to deep causes and reasons that he saw as not unique to this country. French thought sometimes hurls itself into the verbal depths of philosophy separated from practice. It then rediscovers the Cartesian logos, attached to the cogito, the thinking subject, which suits an isolated knowledge, a subjectively abstract intellectuality. In the age of Descartes, the philosophical thesis of the thinking subject had a subversive edge. It was bound up with an individualism on the offensive and with an understanding of practice, social and political. 3 centuries later, it is simply a convenient escape route, or else this thought falls into journalism, accepting or presupposing the confusion between information and cognition. A passionate and passive interest is taken in what happens far away, in Russia, Spain, China, Italy, Czechoslovakia, in the Third World, in Chile, etc. These experiences, generally unfortunate, are expected to provide the recipe applicable to France. Little attention is paid to what is happening close at hand, under our own eyes. It is forgotten that for Marx and Engels, France was the classic country of revolutions, and that political practice here runs ahead of thought. When the German philosophers, at the start of the 19th century, sought to reflect theoretically on what was happening outside their own country, in the rest of Europe, they made up for German backwardness instead of aggravating it. They gained a theoretical function and exercised this, down to Marx and Nietzsche. Besides, nothing happened at home that had great theoretical significance, and even Bismarck's role was only to adapt to a new situation. The Napoleonic model of the state, as elaborated by Hegel, the weakness of French thought is striking. Even after the Commune of 1871 until the Dreyfus affair at the turn of the century, revolutions in France, from the first successful one down to the latest abortive one of 1968, have failed to arouse political reflection and critique, implying the critique of politics. The devious combat between a France openly reactionary in both thought and daily life of Byzantine France and the France of boldness, sometimes fuite en avant, has never ceased. 13. We now come to the title phrase, Kingdom of Shadows. What does this mean? It did not proclaim an unconditional apologia for the works discussed here. Hegel saw and foresaw the omnipresence and omnipotence of the state. He described its rationality, borne by definite social classes and strata, middle class, bureaucracy, technocracy, army, political apparatuses, etc. He even described the deadly boredom that results from this, the shadow on earth for the sun of the idea and the gloomy edifice of the state, the satisfaction of the spirit that had completed its task, the satisfaction of all needs by appropriate work and objects, the satisfaction of the conscious subject, and the self-satisfaction of everything that had reached its plenitude, could only produce a flat and heavy bourgeois happiness. Possession extended to the absolute. Hegel thus declared his science and his own wisdom to have reached its twilight, along with the whole of philosophy. Knowledge, like the owl of Minerva, emerged only as night was falling. The state, it was the old age of the world, the end of history and creative consciousness, an exhaustion proclaimed and provoked by philosophy, by the system, by knowledge and wisdom. As for philosophy, it painted grey on grey dark this greyness as what one might call a privileged symbol and symptom. The death of art, an illusion of 35 youth and human folly. After youth and maturity, the third age brings the process to a close, in a final equilibrium. And like Hegel, Marx did not take as his principal and starting hypothesis the real, the accomplished, but rather the possible. He developed the reasons for revolutionary possibility and its entry into the real by overturning it. He thus sought to rationally establish faith in the possible. Like the Gallic cock that he celebrated in his youthful writings, he trumpeted the eternal dawn, the immortal youth of the revolution, what in fact has been realized, the shadow, the very opposite of the possible proclaimed by Marx, and this with its own signboard, its own vocabulary. Nothing of what proclaimed its end has actually reached this, not even the old philosophy. Nowhere has the working class conquered the status of political subject, collective and revolutionary, carrying society beyond politics. Was Hegel right? Yes, but on all sides there are phenomena of disassociation to be seen, of corruption, of the rottenness of the centralized state. Everywhere there is opposition, appeal, differences and decentralizations. Everywhere state structures are shaking and then reconstructed. And yet, if we can see in every part of the world a tendency towards what Marx proclaimed, nowhere has this tendency indicated anything but a poorly traced path, an uncertain horizon. Hence the immense disappointment already sensed by Marx himself. Dixi et salva vi animum meme. Nietzsche, his life and his work have a meaning, a goal, to say the unsayable, to grasp the ungraspable, to think the unthinkable, to fathom the unfathomable, to realize the impossible, to metamorphose the real, moribund or already dead, into a new life. The poet sought to achieve redemption by what was closest to him, so close that it was unsayable, unthinkable, unfathomable. The body. There is more reason in your body than in your wisdom, said Zarathustra. But what did Nietzsche do, if not dream his body and speak aloud the dream of the body? His Promethean, titanic, effort to live the agony and death of the modern world by transmuting, metamorphosing, its exhausted values and its reality in the course of full self-destruction, did It led towards something, towards the superhuman. Is this not also a figure of consciousness of its dissatisfaction, its sickness, hence a metamorphosis of the divine, a metaphor of the idea, or rather still an adjuration, a conjuration, an invocation, at worst, an opera image for the use of a cultivated elite, still God, still the idea, still the unhappiness of consciousness and culture? Nietzsche went forward. In his 54 forward flight, his shadow accompanied him. Who is Zarathustra, the sick man and the doctor, the bridge or the other bank? If it is true that the state devours society from above by integrating it into itself, if it uses institutionalized knowledge and cognition, then civilization resists. But this resistance is only maintained in an ever more narrow elite, ever more threatened. Nietzsche's madness is rightly seen as evidence of his authenticity. But what does authenticity mean if meaning and truth are shattered? Perhaps he became mad deliberately, to join Dionysus, god of metamorphoses. Nietzsche's madness is a poor response to Hegel's grayness and Marx's disappointment. Night is deeper than day. What should we conclude from this 14? And now we have the dossiers opened wide, displayed, accessible to the broadest public if it takes the trouble to consult them. These preliminaries govern the procedure of the present work, its conception and composition. Procedure, a term that we use instead of method, abused on all sides, used as an alibi and a retreat, the Cartesian echo of which permits its abuse. As for composition, is this the best or the only one possible? No, it is what is appropriate here, unless we are mistaken. Every work, every book, is somehow different, requiring its own procedure, its requirements of construction. The path here proceeds fanwise. At the start, the center, what we have been dealing with here, the Hegel-Marx-Nietzsche conjunction. Already with this first articulation, differences and challenges appear. The work will unfurl and open the fan. Unfailing means more than just unfolding, more than making explicit. The implication-explication will be developed. The unfailing will take the implied differences all the way. It includes a well-ordered development, a captured process of increasing complexity, a convergence between the actual and the conceptual, without either having priority over the other. It avoids separating the three moments of thought, the categorical, concepts, the problematic, the questions raised, and the thematic, the statements made, the proposals elaborated. On the unfurled surface will appear, perhaps, a picture of modernity, paths and perspectives. In other words, the modern world in its terrible complexity, with all its contradictions. This procedure presupposes reprises. A reprise implies a difference that is grasped. It does not always avoid repetition. The present work itself takes up problems treated elsewhere, but it reconsiders these differently, giving them a different import and a different perspective. At the end of this unfurling, will there be just a picture, a map of modernity, showing those who view it certain paths, obstacles, perspectives, blind alleys? Perhaps there will also be a decision to make. 15. To whom is this book addressed? What public does it invite to consult the files, and if possible set themselves up to judge? This book is addressed to us. Nothing is easier to misuse than this pronoun, and yet Nietzsche, despite advising against it, makes wide use of it. We, the new Europeans, the new philosophers who supersede philosophy, the feeling and thinking, the seekers, attempters, those without a homeland, how sad it is that we have. Vis-a-vis the fine words that the others spread around. Very ugly second thoughts. This was said and happened before the invasion of pragmatism, functionalism. The avowed or unavowed champions of this pragmatism reject the we. Very well. We also need enemies if the pragmatists and empiricists believe they can emerge from the shadows. 135. And enter the light. They make people laugh as soon as they open their mouths. What is meant here by this word? Western man questioning himself and his unique property. Logos. Modern man with his love of technology. The philosophers of modernity who trap it by one corner or another. The list goes on. All of us. We, those who advance on tiptoe, in a paradoxical world, in a penumbra. If only this world presented itself like architecture, with clear contours, edges and angles. We flatter it by calling it complex, which is highly contradictory. Now, contradictions are blunted or seem to be blunted in favor of various logics. But these logics confront one another in a game in which contradictions reappear as surprises, as paradoxes, and the shadows go among the shadows. 3 stars gravitate, eliminating lesser or invisible planets, above this world in which shadows dance, ourselves. Stars in a sky in which the sun of intelligibility is no more than a symbol and no longer offers anything in the way of a firmament. Perhaps these stars vanish behind clouds hardly less obscure than the night in myth. From the poetry of Homer to the divine comedy, the realm of shadows possessed an entrance and exit, a guided trajectory and mediating powers. It had gates, those of an underground city, overshadowed by the earthly city and the city of God. Today, where are the gates of the realm of shadows? Where is the way out? The Hegel File 1. What was the social status of knowledge in France, and in Europe, before the 19th century? The standard history of philosophy, one of ideas and ideologies, which examines abstract constructions from within, has difficulty answering this. As for the epistemological question, one of theoretical status, that is a different matter, secondary and derivative if we accept the terms of the question. Theoretical status follows and derives from social status. In the old triad of orders or estates, stand in German, nobility, clergy and third estate, knowledge belonged to the clerics. The nobility had action, war, festivals, tournaments and pleasures. For the third estate, productive work, agriculture, handicrafts and commerce. For the clerics, contemplation, knowledge and tranquility. What knowledge? An unholy mixture of theological metaphors and philosophical concepts. Ideology had official status, institutionalized in the church. In relation to this corpus, doctrinal body, solidly maintained, kept in hand, by very varied means, cognition was born only on the margins. It therefore had a fundamental critical edge, starting with Abelard, then Rabelais and Montaigne, Kepler and Galileo, Descartes and Newton. The prevailing history of ideas gives a good account of the growth of knowledge, but a very poor one of the conflictual relationship between this marginality, going as far as heresy and apostasy, rebellion against all authorities, and the various statuses, estates. This history reduces the relationship to a criticism of authority, whereas the conflict had a wider reach. The uncertain status of cognition shook all forms of assured status in the social and political context. To whom should knowledge be imputed? Who managed it? The church and its institutions. The clergy and clerics could not possess critical knowledge as such, neither transmit it nor increase it. They transmuted it into Ideology. Now, cognition has a cumulative character and demands management, self-management by those responsible, scholars. Through contradictions, cognition pronounces its logical judgment, all or nothing, with the result that the social status of cognition shook the existing society as much as did its actual content. In the same way as the growth of the productive forces and the rise of the bourgeoisie causes that precisely exercise their action by way of knowledge and its management, the facts are familiar enough, but there is often a failure to interpret, appreciate and connect them. In the 17th century, the so-called Great Century, which saw the consolidation of a centralized state in France, a gulf developed between knowledge and power. Cognition was hardly less heretical, in political terms, than religious heresy. Even mathematics seemed subversive, and still more so physics. As Descartes showed, the connection of algebraic signs has nothing in common with scholastic abstractions and the properties of substantial forms. His theory of refraction ruined the old symbolism of the rainbow. Despite a drift of Cartesian reason towards raison d'etre, Descartes exiled himself to Amsterdam. Scientific heresy linked up with religious heresy in Jansenism and Pascal. Scientific societies, functioning partly by correspondence, letters, and almost clandestine, practiced the self-management of knowledge. The state combated this practice by institutionalizing cognition in the form of academies and academicism. We need not recall in detail how in the 18th century the growth of knowledge accompanied the rise of the bourgeoisie. Cognition found unforeseen support and invaded social and political practice. On the one hand, it was linked to art and music, which saw an extraordinary upsurge in the wake of discoveries in physics, mathematics and technology. On the other hand, it was linked with production, initially not so much with industry, which was still weak in France, as with agriculture, which demanded improvement and perfection. The connection of science and industry by the mediation of technology would soon strengthen the connection between knowledge and productive activity foreshadowed by the encyclopedia, and operating already in England by the end of the century, the encyclopedia, and the work of Diderot, marks an epoch, not only because of philosophy, materialism, emerged from it, or because the church and the monarchy recoiled in the face of this bold intellectual enterprise, but because the social status of science changed, wrested from the clergy and clerics, entrusted to a new stratum, intellectuals, managed by them to a large extent outside of state control. It established itself as a power alongside political authority. Here again, the break was political more than philosophical or epistemological, the former encompassing the latter. Any new science, political economy, for example, supplants another, and the corpus scientiarum cognition, considered from within, was certainly transformed, but also and above all its social status, which was the dominant aspect, as far as knowledge was concerned. Its socio-political demand and command changed profoundly during this period. The French Revolution confirmed this change and continued it by accentuating the process already begun, the connection between knowledge, bourgeoisie and nation-state, not without introducing new contradictions, for example the rights of the individual designated man and citizen, which almost inevitably conflicted with those of the nation state. This casts light on the contradictory character of this great revolution, both bourgeois and democratic. The compromise between these conflicting terms being immediately subjected to harsh tests, it is a historical fact that the bourgeois, democratic revolution revisited the social status of knowledge in order to nationalize it. Not only did it secularize the entire edifice of cognition, it rationalized, and thus statized, it also wrested it from self-management, even though the interested parties sought to keep some responsibilities. This was a demand of the ideologues under Napoleon. The French Revolution created a number of scientific institutions separate from each other, though unofficially it maintained cognition under the sign of encyclopedism. By the same token, it created contradictions that would subsequently follow their own course, between universalism and nationalism. For example, the cult and festival of reason, so often ridiculed, had the eminent meaning that knowledge and power tend towards a unity, with knowledge drawing prodigious energy from its struggle, and ire revolutionary, power submitting, in appearance, to reason. Hegel was not mistaken. For him, the French Revolution represented the negative power of the concept, absolute knowledge asserting itself by clearing the ground, as the end of history approached. In French thought in the French Revolution, Hegel distinguished three aspects: a destructive and negative aspect, poorly understood and received, but the most important, a positive and constructive aspect, and a philosophical and metaphysical, hence transcendent, aspect, that he, Hegel, had extracted after having done justice to the negative aspect. French philosophy and politics, lively and mobile, were ontological assertion, the actual work of the spirit. The revolution, for Hegel, was the concept in action, and even the absolute concept that turns against the whole domain of accepted ideas and frozen thoughts. The revolution brought the fall of those entities that had falsely governed consciousness and science, good and evil, faith in God and his providence, the power of wealth and the power of divine awe, natural right, duties and submission to imperatives external to knowledge. With French philosophy and the French Revolution, and still more so with Napoleon, the absolute spirit manifested itself by accepting and receiving into itself its movement, negative and positive, destructive and creative, hence its self-generation, its moments. As for the serious danger that differences would disappear in the objectivized essence, actualized in the national state, Hegel had a hard time averting it. Hegel thus rightly appears in history, with a greater claim than other German philosophers. Kant, Fichte, as the thinker of the French Revolution, he perceived and reflected it, along with its continuation in the Napoleonic epoch, from the depths of his backward Germany. The German philosopher was not content simply to transcribe political facts into his own language. He placed these in perspective and created for this the language of the concept. A clarity emerged that seemed definitive. This conceptual language corresponded to the languages current in Europe. It took these to a higher level of mutual comprehension. Moreover, it extracted and formulated the essential feature of the revolution by proclaiming its future, the bourgeois rather than the democratic side. The ascendant movement leading to absolute knowledge did not proceed only through science or the sciences, the adventures and avatars of consciousness. or the slow progress of institutions. Hegelian logos summed up and focused Western logos by way of a production that the whole world would imitate the nation-state. Hegelianism did not present itself as a second-degree discourse on philosophy, science and its history, but as a first-degree discourse on a political action that no longer had a direct expression, with the same scope as Clausewitz. Though in a different language, Hegel held a strategic discourse and defined a strategy, that of absolute politics and the political absolute. 2. At the center, then, the vertical pivot or axis, knowledge. In other words, the concept, or, more rigorously, the concept of the concept, its objectively reflected essence rather than the subjective reflection. One thing that I think, which gets lost in the bad infinity of illusory subjectivity, whereas in the concept according to Hegel, subjective freedom constitutes itself a substance. The concept, the power of truth both negative and positive, clears the path by eliminating what does not suit it, errors, illusions, lies, appearances, accidental representations. To this concept, generally seen as impotent abstraction, Hegel attributed every capacity. It lives, it works, it produces, it fights. In 1844, Marx would mock these activities of the Hegelian concept by the same gesture. This animated concept does away with the crazy, the abnormal, the pathogenic and pathological, the weaknesses of consciousness in the process of becoming, the despairs of the unhappy consciousness and the hopes of the beautiful soul, logically disappear, whereas the least trace of knowledge, from sensation to reason, is preserved. In a language that is not exactly Hegelian, we could say that conceptual knowledge eliminates ideology and along with it the poetic delirium of speech. The dramatic ordeals of the concept include this struggle and this meaning. They have a cathartic function, in the last instance epistemological, so that Hegel did not have to discern in philosophy a core and a periphery. The circle drawn around the center forms part of knowledge, animated from bottom to top and from start to finish. It contains the absolute. To be sure, neither Hegel nor any Hegelian suspected the infernal vicious circle, the remarkable tautology. Knowledge knows the real is knowledge. Tautology or magic, logology and or incantation, both, the concrete and the abstract coincide, the fact and the idea, thus the end and the means of knowledge. The real, what we know, defines knowledge, and knowledge defines the real by rejecting the unreal, not just the apparent, but also the VQ, lived experience, identified by decree with appearance, with the phenomenon, with accidental representations and the illusions of subjectivity. No Hegelian, down to our own time, is aware of the gulf that opens up between lived experience and the concept, and that this conflict has serious consequences. None of them can admit that the necessary is not therefore sufficient, and that the sufficiency of knowledge as such represents only a postulate, an accidental representation proclaimed as essential. Knowledge accumulates. It alone, for Hegel, has this cumulative character. It has superiority over memory, reminiscence, recognition, the imaginary, the symbolic, all of which have no autonomy, so no novelty, yet the duplication of self-consciousness, reflectivity, the capacity to reflect on things and oneself, already proclaims the cumulative power of cognition. Around the axis, the crystalline column, the moments of knowledge are arranged. They support each other and mount up in two dimensions, horizontally and vertically. Knowledge extends in width around its center, and grows in height towards the pinnacle of the idea and the spirit. Discontinuities and disjunctions in the process compromise neither its cohesion nor its arrangement. If it has moments, none of these substantial moments disappear into nothingness along with illusions and appearances. The edifice regularly grows. Its pieces adjust and cement themselves in contrast to this. For example, discontinuity reigns in art, and in the phenomenology of consciousness, which emphasizes subjectivity. Knowledge in the strict sense escapes these inconveniences, which explains a certain paradox, without suppressing it. Hegel appeals to the Revolution French, bourgeois democratic. He theorizes it, and yet, according to him, the revolution abolished nothing apart from a few illusions. The essential aspect, the moments persist and subsist. Family, corporations and trades, morality and even religion. In short, whatever pertains, or seems to pertain, to reason. Neither Hegel nor the Hegelians understood the paralogism inherent to their logicism. Sometimes logic, as theory of coherence and cohesion, dissolves into dialectic, the theory of contradictions. Sometimes logic absorbs dialectic, and cohesion prevails over contradiction. On many occasions Hegel asserted the priority, anteriority, essentiality of the dialectical process. Becoming, the first concrete thought, the first notion, outclasses the empty abstractions of being and nothingness. Pure being and pure nothingness coincide, truth lying neither in the one nor the other, but in the fact that being does not pass, but is passed, into nothingness, and nothingness into being. As Hegel declares early on in the Science of Logic, a philosophy that starts from being as being, or nothingness as nothingness, deserves to be called a system of abstract identity. It ignores movement, the power of the concept and movement. In other words, dialectical movement, coincide. The concept's moving principle I call dialectic. This dialectic is not an activity of subjective thinking applied to some matter externally, but it is rather the matter's very soul putting forth its branches and fruits organically. What then does Hegel's famous dialectical method consist in? A method that so many people claim to use, yet is defined so rarely and so poorly, given the difficulties that mount up. First of all, that knowledge according to Hegel, in other words, the concept, progresses and produces its determinations in immanent fashion. Second, that analysis, which Hegel calls the understanding, discovers determinations in the things analyzed, but discerns and thus posits them separately, each outside the other ipetus extra partes. In the word Spinoza used to characterize the first and lower of the three types of cognition, dialectical reason dissolves these determinations of the understanding by grasping their unity, with the result that it positively produces the universal. Above the senses and the understanding, the highest level raises itself, intelligent reason and rational understanding. At this level the knowledge that initially posited distinction, this is that A is B, denies it. Then, and only then, it is dialectical, situating A and B in their relationship and their becoming their conflicts. For example, the leaf is green, pencil is red, concept of leaf or pencil, is transformed. The leaf is no longer green, it is drying up, etc. Reason re-establishes its starting point, the separate determination A, as a particularity grasped concretely in its relations and movement, by the universality of the the concept. Third, dialectic consists in the opposition of true and false being no longer in any way fixed. Common sense, in other words, the understanding, accepts or rejects an assertion or a system en bloc. It does not conceive the difference of philosophical systems as the development of the true. For it, diversity means absurdity, unacceptable contradiction. However, the bud disappears when the blossom breaks through, and we might say that the former is refuted by the latter. These stages are not merely differentiated. They supplant one another as being incompatible with one another. Is this perhaps the place and time, the moment for confession? Hegel turns the situation upside down, reverses his own movement. He begins by presupposing and positing the dialectic, taking this to the ultimate paradox of rejecting mathematical method as abstract and empty, logico-quantitative. Only the dialectical method gives access to the concrete, the real. Hegel describes the eternal movement in almost Dionysian terms, a bacchanalia in which not a member is sober. He refers explicitly to Heraclitus, and then suddenly the background, perspective, even essence is changed. Logic is in command. It ensures the cohesion of a construction, resolving the contradictions that it raises, except in appearance and in the conflicts between the apparent and the real, the concrete. To see that thought is in its very nature dialectical, and that, as understanding, it must fall into contradiction negative of itself will form one of the main lessons of logic. According to this passage from the introduction to the Encyclopedia Logic, it is at the level of the understanding that thought contradicts itself. It follows that dialectical reason puts an end to the contradictions of analysis, which then seem to arise from what the analytical understanding separates by discerning the aspects and moments of things. This is indeed what the continuation of this passage states. When thought grows hopeless of ever achieving, by its own means, the solution of the contradiction which it has by its own action brought upon itself, it turns back to those solutions of the question with which the mind had learned to pacify itself in some of its other modes and forms. According to Hegel, at the higher level of the spirit, logic is re-established and carries the day. The spirit makes the separate determinations and the contradictions between them disappear. It resolves conflicts. Solution means resolution. Within the very process, no contradiction affects the spirit. Everything happens in the Hegelian system as if contradiction was born within from alienation. The absolute idea that emerges from itself, alienates itself in nature, then finds itself, recognizes itself or reproduces itself in full consciousness and cognition by way of history and conceptual knowledge. Alienation makes contradiction vanish, and hence dialectic. What is the role of the negative at this level? It has disappeared. It served only as mediator and absolute spirit between the finite and the infinite, simultaneously containing and superseding this spirit, the one in the other, the one by 10 the other, and yet the one after the other. The metaphorical reference to nature that Hegel constantly employs, as in the phenomenology, the flower replaces the blossom, the fruit replaces the flower, the organic ensemble produces branch, flower and fruit, confirms this critical analysis. It turns out that the processes to which Hegel refers have a cyclical determination, or character, rather than a dialectical one. The blossom generates the flower, which generates the fruit, which generates seeds and blossoms, and so on. The process is reproduced, but this raises a problem. Organic beings, plants, animals are relatively stable totalities. Hegel, seeing nature as the first product of the idea, which emerges from itself to project itself into matter, perceives not so much contradictions as balanced developments, a contrary situation to that of history. Spirit finally re-establishes the organic, at the highest level. Hegel and Hegelianism thus proceed to the self-destruction of the dialectic that they generated, and we understand why Marx, and then Engels, re-established the rights of thought in the dialectical method against the Hegelians and Hegel himself, as a particular and privileged case of turning the world upside down. What remains of Hegelianism? After such harsh operations, by defending his dialectic, do we not risk demolishing it, dismantling dialectical thought itself, which cannot be defined as a method indifferent to its content, indifferent to the system? Is it better then to keep, though modifying, the triadic system that Hegel took to an apogee? And what is the exact relationship between logic and dialectic? Does logic shatter in dialectic? Is it continued, or articulated to something else? Nothing in the world dies away except by self-destruction, said Nietzsche. Hegel was remarkably embarrassed by the self-destruction of his own dialectic. This produced a paradox, an aporia. Difference. What is difference? Hegel ponders at length in Book 2 of the Science of Logic. He finds it hard to reach an answer. Identity repeats itself. A is A, but the second A differs from the first. It reproduces it, but is not the same, simply because it is second. A thus differs from itself, and difference goes back into identity, and yet it stipulates the non-identity of the identical itself. In difference, the one separates from the same, and the same from the other, but then difference becomes oppositions, insofar as, in other words, in the various and separate determinations that the understanding posits and that reason supersedes. It seems then that, for Hegel, difference represents simply an attenuated case of dialectical contradiction, without negative power, which leads him to ask whether the statement AI things are different has any interest at all. Without diversity, there would not be things. The proposition is reduced to a tautology, on top of which, the difference thus represented is general, abstract and vague, thus indeterminate. When Leibniz invited ladies to look among the leaves of a tree for two that were identical, it was a happy time for philosophy. No other proof was needed than the leaves of a tree. Hegel is unable to escape his embarrassment by irony. He extricates himself with formulations that are too simplistic. Is not difference indifferent vis-a-vis both identity and non-identity? Contradiction? This would later generate a number of problems. Is difference resolved or dissolved, either in the identical or in the conflictual? Is it simply a specific, differentiating activity among differences? Is there a crucial difference between those that can be reduced, being internal to a system, and the irreducible ones, residues resistant to any reductive operation, which characterize either distinct systems or non-systems? 3. What form does absolute spirit assume in order to definitively establish the cohesion of the construction? The political form. The edifice is built up brick by brick, moment by moment. It seems to be that of knowledge, pure and absolute, but it is actually none other than the state. For state and knowledge coincide more rigorously. They are two aspects, two moments of one and the same actuality as indissoluble as the ideal and the real. Theoretical philosophy and practical action. The necessity that governs the whole process has three moments. Condition, the presupposed moment, which realizes itself in the course of the process. Thing, produced as content and external existence. And activity, movement that proceeds from the conditions to the thing, that produces the thing by making it emerge from the conditions. Fundamentally rational. All the way from organic nature that is restored at the level of the spirit, the idea, and therefore the state, this embodiment of the idea. Necessity does many things. It successively posits the condition, then what the condition makes possible, thing, reality, and activity, productive, work, political action. A triple effectiveness that goes further than causality and finality taken separately. Activity taken in isolation remains subjective. It requires particular conditions to produce it. The thing taken in isolation has no interest or meaning. It is inexplicable, and if nothing generates it, it does not come into existence. Only the organic ensemble of three moments has a meaning and an intelligible spiritual necessity. The same necessity at work in its three moments is recognized in knowledge, in productive activity, and materially in political action. In other words, the triadic rhythm is found in each term, together ensuring the organic ensemble. In each domain, the activity summoned by the ensemble discovers its specific conditions. From this point, it can simultaneously assert itself subjectively, and generate things, objectively, which reacts reciprocal action on the conditions, initially to reaffirm them, then to supersede them. In Hegelianism, a rationalization of the historical and revolutionary process that instituted the nation-state, as already in Robespierrean ideology, knowledge is the foundation of power. It legitimates this by subordinating it, discreetly. The revolutions that until now have changed the face of empires have had as their object simply a change of dynasty. The French Revolution is the first to have been founded on theory. Robespierre's last speech to the convention. If you want factions to disappear, and that no one should seek to raise themselves on the debris of public liberty by the platitudes of Machiavelli, then make politics powerless. The same day, Hegel seems at first to reject the Napoleonic experience, which re-established harsh reality by erecting the state above society and its moments, and indeed to misunderstand it. He sees in Napoleon the immense vigor of a character embodying the world spirit, who governs by imposing respect in place of deference, and then turns his force outward, spreading liberal institutions everywhere. Hegel says nothing of Bonapartism, except that it led to the impotence of victory, and that the irony of history worked against it. At the center of the state, the pivot and core, Hegel puts the political class. This takes charge of knowledge and possesses competence. A genuine estate within the state, a power elite, a body that recruits itself by rational means. Competition, it ensures the functioning of society, and the ideology used, religious or secular, seems of little importance for Hegel. His philosophy of right offers an apologia for this social stratum or class, being both selective and stable. It deserves every praise. Why? Because it knows. It is acquainted with the social ensemble, and can thus make it work. There is no trace of determinism or blind automatism in this functioning, nor again of arbitrary domination. From this center, in the political class, knowledge holds the state and makes it hold. Immanent rationality is concentrated in this higher stratum of the thinking class, middle class, which coincides with the lower stratum of those who govern and who nominally exercise power. It bears and supports them. Hegelianism thus makes the following presupposition. Given that the rationality diffused and infused in the whole society is concentrated at the apex, the political instances are able to cognize, by knowledge, and resolve, by decision and action, all contradictions and conflicts that may arise at lower levels, between the moments, components and elements of the edifice. If there are such conflicts, they can only be of minor importance. They do not shake the construction of state and nation. Knowledge power is capable of reducing them or finding a solution that makes them disappear. Contradictions are reducible, apparent rather than real. Temporary incoherency is in a coherent whole. This is how Hegel posits the problem that would dominate both the new, so-called human or social sciences, during the 19th and even the 20th century, and also philosophy when this refused to be tied to metaphysical entities of being and consciousness, thought and life, intuition and reflection in general. This is the problem of the whole or totality in human reality. How is it that a multitude of often rival activities are unaware of one another, or compete with one another, yet constitute an ensemble? How is it that after disturbances, revolution or war, this ensemble reconstitutes itself? Why does it not fall into pieces and fragments? What prevents it from atomizing into individuals or groups? What is it that makes a people, a nation, a class a class? It is not hard to wax ironic at Hegel's response, and we may as well do so here. Hegel answers, there is a whole because it is a whole in obvious tautology, and very likely, after a detailed critique, we will reach the conclusion that the Hegelian presupposition of a global logic, a system, a coherent ensemble, is summed up in this tautology. But the proposition, which appears ridiculously repetitive, takes another aspect when expressed differently. There is a whole because there is a totalizing reason, and this is how Hegelianism shows its strength. Reason, knowledge, concept, they exist, they have a role, a function, an action. Why not presuppose them and place them at the center, at the core, in the axis around which the whole establishes itself? How can a whole be constructed and maintained, except by cognition of it? It is true that both before and after Hegel, other philosophers and scholars defined the whole differently. For vitalists and romantics, the properties of the organic whole precede thought. Only the living being, qua living, is a whole, generating and maintaining itself by the force of life until this abandons it. Thought has no need to rise to life. In order to confirm and complete the qualities of life in its own form, it has first of all to accept them in their immediacy, and reflection has something posterior and even foreign about it in relation to the first essence of things. For vitalism, philosophy starts from intuition, the alpha and omega of cognition. The absolute is not conceived or perceived, it is sensed. At the start of the phenomenology, Hegel rejects this mystic naturalism, that of Schelling and romanticism. These apocalyptic utterances pretend to occupy the very center and the deepest depths. They look askance at all definiteness and preciseness of meaning, and they deliberately hold back from conceptual thinking and the constraining necessities of thought, as being the sort of reflection which, they say, can only feel at home in the sphere of finitude. But just as there is a breadth which is emptiness, there is a depth which is empty too. This intuitionism tramples the roots of humanity underfoot, for the nature of humanity is to tend to rational agreement, to communication, to the community of consciousnesses through science. These texts aimed at Schelling would also be applicable to Schopenhauer, and we can say, a century and a half later, that they foreshadow Nietzsche. It is also true that already before Hegel, the English economists, Adam Smith, etc., and others as well, Saint Simon, had conceived the economic social political whole in a more realist manner than Hegel, without any mysticism. For Adam Smith, the market, productive work and the division of labor, the exchange of products, was enough to explain the cohesion of the ensemble. For Saint Simon, rationality lay neither in the concept, nor in knowledge as such, but in productive work, in industry. The French Revolution, the rise of the Third Estate, allowed this underlying rationality, previously denied or concealed, to surge forth. According to the economists, the market arises from a vast interaction of demand and supply, a spontaneous process. As Marx would show in his analysis of exchange value, it obtains a certain regulation blindly, in the manner of processes governed by physical laws, rather than by a mysterious internal unity, hence a rationality that excludes neither accidents nor contradictions nor difficulties crises. Productive activity, industry, their rationality results from a practical relationship between activity and its object. From the moment that a man fashioned an object with his hands, with his body, with an instrument, a flint, a bone, a stick, this rationality was at work. Man who operated rationally once could do so a second and a third time. He knew where to place the tool, where to find the material, how to hold it in his fingers. And what is true of industrial activity is also true of collective activities, workshops, firms. Saint Simon was aware of and familiar with this emergence of the rational, starting with a conceived primordial practice, already in Hegel's lifetime. Should we then disavow Hegelianism? Ridicule it? No doubt it is precisely here that it shows its strength. Hegel was familiar with the work of the English economists. He took these into account. Saint Simon, Hegel's rival in the power and scope of his concepts, was either ignorant of them or misunderstood them, yet he cannot be accused of irrealism. The system of needs, and the division of labor as a system, were demonstrated by Hegel with a positivity equal to that of the Saint Simonians of his time. With him, these two systems fit each other precisely, like pieces in a puzzle. Two subsystems are inserted and integrated. They correspond to one another objectively, whereas the political class constitutes the subjectivity of the state, ensuring law and right a foundation endowed with cohesion and equilibrium. Here Hegel's line of argument is on firm ground. Is it not necessary for the needs of individuals living together to define themselves, and for them to harmonize with rather than destroy one another? Need has first of all a subjective existence, but it obeys the universal movement rational and dialectical, by which the subjective seeks to objectify itself, yet manages to do so only by transforming the object into subjectivity. We know that this movement culminates in knowledge, in the concept, higher unity of the objective and the subjective. Need both seeks an object and arises from the object sought. What does it expect from its quest and from the object? Satisfaction. How does it obtain this? By possession of the object, followed by its destruction, consumption. And yet this object was produced by others. It corresponds to other needs, to other wills and other activities. For Hegel, these relationships give rise to the sphere of political economy, the science which starts from this view of needs and labor but then has the task of explaining mass relationships and mass movement in their complexity and their qualitative and quantitative character. This is one of the sciences which have arisen out of the conditions of the modern world. Its development affords the interesting spectacle of thought working upon the endless mass of details which confront it at the outset and extracting therefrom the simple principles of the thing, the understanding effective in the thing and directing it, according to common sense. The baker, builder, teacher, etc. already exist, and from their activities there results something that maintains and reproduces itself. Everyday life, that of the family, the trade, the group, the village or the town. In short, what Hegel calls the life of civil society. This is simple, even if there are petty quarrels among these moments. The economist sees things as rather more complicated, so that the Concordia discourse of activities and civil society requires an analysis and a theory. Hegel arrives as a philosopher, and pronounces that he supersedes both common sense, the domain of the understanding, unaware of itself as such, and the particularized science of political economy, which discovers a rationality whose source it is unaware of. He, the philosopher, will give political economy a foundation by showing the origin and complementarity of the system of needs and the system of labors, despite the accidental conflicts that arise. What happens to need and labor? The two things each separately, the one a social need and the other a social labor, necessarily become abstract. This leads them to pass from nature to the concept, or rather it reveals the conceptual rationality inherent to the immediate and the natural. Full stop. Natural and subjective singularities fall away, to make room for defined and thus general needs. In what way? That of reciprocal action, which implies communication, exchange, the mutual recognition of needs. If subject A seeks to impose his need on subject B, the latter does nothing for him. Each consciousness confronts the other in a struggle to the death. To put an end to this unending confrontation, A recognizes the need of B, and B the need of A. What they exchange is not only things, objects, but also their subjective needs. By way of this mutual recognition, B's need becomes A's as well, and vice versa. In the reciprocal act, communication and exchange, needs are socially divided and multiplied, and so are the modes of their satisfaction. Individual needs form part of the generally recognized need, which is both abstract and definite, particularized within universality, the ensemble. Thus, individual A may have his particular tastes, his secret tendencies, he may like this or that. By becoming social, however, his need can find satisfaction only in the products of social labor, food, clothing, habitation, etc. Thus, the social moment frees the individual from what was singular, unique, incommunicable about him. Communication, through language, and exchange of objects each work towards this result, knowledge. At this level, understanding and representation, dominating natural necessity, in the course of the interaction between objects and subjects. Therefore, an important mediation intervenes, labor. This follows the same process as need, it becomes abstraction, a social abstraction. Individual efforts and natural gestures that are pleasant for the individual, those of play, of childhood, lose their meaning. The disciplined gestures of production, imposed by collective activity, make up, according to Hegel, a practical culture, complementary to the theoretical culture arising from objects already in use. Here, it is language that ensures a match. Like needs, social labor divides by multiplying. The division of labor, which Hegel never criticizes, has this dialectical aspect, the multiplication of labors and needs. The result of this is the system of productive labors, complementary to the system of needs. It results from the harmony between the two systems that social needs are produced and reproduced with an apparent spontaneity, an automatism, and labors likewise. Abstraction, a universal element and objective of labor, extends to the means, tools. Like skill hands, tools increasingly form part of knowledge and demand cognition. In their own way they also become abstract, a third term along with need and labor. The ensemble thus leaves the sphere of the natural and immediate. 2. Form part of concrete abstraction. The abstraction of one man's production from another's makes work more and more mechanical, until finally man is able to step aside and install machines in his place. Truth that the encyclopedia also repeats. Abstract labor becomes both uniform and easy. It enables an increase in the scale of production, by subordinating a fragmented technical activity to the social whole. The skill itself becomes in this way mechanical, and gets the capability of letting the machine take the place of human labor. 114 on eminent 115 in the extreme case. Therefore, universal fortune simultaneously allows the general satisfaction of needs, the mechanization of labor, production, and the self-regulation of the social ensemble, each subjective activity of individuals and groups being necessarily transformed into a contribution to the satisfaction of everyone else. This rational optimism thus foresees a stabilized and balanced state of things, a state in which relations between the partial systems, the moments and elements, the subsystems themselves, support one another, being produced and reproduced in an assured equilibrium and stability. This is a perfect automatism of the ensemble within abstraction, in an edifice coherent both horizontally, the complementary elements, and vertically, from the bottom, production, to the top, the political leader. Does this structure not seem stable enough to withstand any test? At the bottom, the two producing classes, peasants and workers. Above these, the middle, thinking, bureaucratic class, from which come the managers, the executives, the expert and competent. If the state cements and crowns the edifice, this is because it is the supreme identity of knowledge and power. Need we insist on the grandeur of this analysis? This picture? First of all, there emerges from it the concept of social labor, with its implications, exchange, commodities, division of labor, and its consequences. The automatic machine. Hegel refines the discoveries of Adam Smith, and the theoretical elements of the new science of political economy. Marx would take these over completely, without neglecting the critical aspect, which is found in Smith but which Hegel misunderstands. The division of labor mutilates the individual, obscures the process of production and consequently cognition of the socio-political ensemble. With this reservation about alienated and alienating labor, Marx would present the concrete abstractions, commodities and labor, in the Hegelian line as modified by political critique. Second, how can the amazing topicality of Hegel's exposition be denied? The modern state, run by a political class, that combines technocrats and professional politicians, they sometimes coincide, has no other aim, end, meaning or perspective than the automatic reproduction of its own structure, coinciding with the production that it controls. In the political automatism, man promoted to citizen and defined by citizenship is supposed to accept without protest or murmur the satisfactions offered to him by the state, physical, cultural, political, an admirable triptych. No joke. By caricaturing a little, hardly, we could say that man, who has disappeared as such, changed into citizen soldier and, in the extreme case, into political soldier in the Bonapartist mold, figures as a piece of an admirable machine of the military type. Even if ignorant of Hegel, or familiar only second-hand, how many leaders, notables, politicians and technocrats would not recognize this picture in themselves? However it arises, we have here Nietzsche's eternal recurrence, the circle of circles, vicious, infernal, perfect, the sphere of spheres. We are in an immediacy rediscovered by way of mediation's history, action, cognition, in an identity recaptured by way of conflicts and contradictions. The political machine, the automatic ensemble, becomes a reality with the replacement of labor by specialized machines. Well-oiled and maintained by technomechanics, the great political machine will turn forever, turn on itself, with all its wheels and cogs. If it does not come unstuck, it may even expand. The eternal recurrence of the same and the identical is the state, which generates itself and is self-generated, which is perfected and self-regulated, and remains stable in the consumption of objects and the consumption of subjects. Eternity, the eminent, the supreme, is presented and achieved in this ensemble and its divine plenitude. At what price? We have a sense of the price paid for this access to absolute and divinized politics. 4. Knowledge founded on power, and power founded on knowledge, determine what escapes them, thus what they dismiss, in full knowledge of the causes and effects. Since reason contains the code of being, and can decipher the existing with no other residue than the unnameable and insignificant, the rational defines the irrational. What does this mean? The dominant logic defines differences in order to reject them, but not differences internal to the system. In fact, it never achieves the homogeneity of a monolithic block, even though politicians pursue this design. It contains and includes a diversity, executives, classes, organs, institutions, laws. What state rationality cannot tolerate is what does not conform to its form. External difference. Philosophically speaking, the system defines alienation, understanding by this non-conformity as well as revolt and madness. In relation to the central and axle logos, Hegelian alienation is determined as with the Greeks, hubris, disturbance and even merely suspect ambiguity. Worse, knowledge set up in power, rejects or misunderstands subjectivity as such, hence lived experience of Iku. This can be manipulated. It disappears along with the unhappy, rebel consciousness or the beautiful soul, which dreams of a more beautiful life, so severely judged by Hegel in the Phenomenology. Lived experience may protest and challenge, demand or rebel, but it is in the wrong. Why? Because it does not have reason on its side. We perceive that among the Hegelian moments there are those that disappear because they pertain to the phenomenon, and moments that are preserved because they form part of knowledge. Alienation from the system is defined by the system, but this definition can never be published officially, which in practice leaves a large part to circumstances. Thus to the arbitrariness that the system claims to eliminate, severe conceptual knowledge refuses to take into consideration non-knowledge, knowledge halfway to the concept, or even critical thought. It removes them from the luminous center, casting them into outer darkness. Thus silence about everyday life sex. This is completely contained in the concept of the family, the state being defined from this point of view as substance that combines the family principle and the principle of civil society, labor and needs, other groups than the family. As the encyclopedia declares without ambiguity, love, the natural sentiment, number 116 longer exists in the state, as sentiment. Love is simply an enormous contradiction, since the subject, I, seeks to realize itself in another person. Ethics, morality, resolves this contradiction, making the alienation of love disappear. In the family, and only here, the sexual and emotional relationship gains its significance, a moral one, naturally. As for the destination of woman, 17 this is housework, non-knowledge semi-knowledge, halfway between ignorance and cognition, that concerning physical pleasure and fertility which was formerly transmitted in secret by old and young women, oral knowledge, unwritten and impossible to write down. This fount of social practice is misunderstood, ignored, despised and rejected by Hegel. Hegelianism and the Hegelian state, which seek to crush it. The body is seen as pertaining to natural immediacy, outside of rationality, in alienation and contradiction, in the singularity of the incommunicable, in an incontestably brilliant manner. Hegel grasps and envisages the threatening possibilities of a liberation of lived experience. Hence of the body, children have the right to education. Why? Because of their own feeling of dissatisfaction, because they long to grow up. But if pedagogy should see the infantile element as having any value, play, for example, it ceases to be serious. It represents children as mature in immaturity, and thus falls into contradiction. It makes them satisfied with themselves, driving them more into alienation. Children will not respect it, as it 18 communicates to them a contempt for adults. Order defines disorder. Hierarchy acquires precision and consolidation. According to Hegel, in a state, at every degree of the political edifice, that of knowledge and of life, logos means the triumph of logic, theory and practice of coherence, which arrogates to itself the right to exclude incoherence. Hence whatever disturbs cohesion, the logic of state brings with it a broad strategy, and coincides with this. It is embodied to varying degrees in rulers, more or less eminent, big and little leaders, various dignitaries. We already know a good deal about the political class and its knowledge. What Hegel sees as the most important aspect, however, is still to come. These people, the political class, whose only task is to think, to manage the conceived ensemble, and to decide at the highest level, are above the division of labor. Do the great leaders need to know everything? Able to decide, unable to know everything. They have to surround themselves with competent advisors, scientists, diplomats, etc., themselves candidates for the roles of leaders and future leaders. We can examine the state edifice either from outside in, from the internal to the external, the central axis to the peripheries, or from inside out, philosophically, from the discursive and analytical understanding, which remains among the separated things with separate activities, to the necessary and sufficient rationality that cleaves to the center. Outside, on the periphery, analysis encounters such external necessities as the police, for example, or corporations. Penetrating within, it encounters justice and administration. At the most central position stands the government, close to the idea and the spirit. 19 as Hegel declares without the least irony. At the top position there is satisfaction, that of people who carry out their task well, honestly. Blessedness is a satisfaction, Hegel says in his Aesthetics, which places the satisfaction of political virtue above aesthetic joy, individual happiness and the serenity of knowledge, as their synthesis. 5. In order to properly situate the Hegelian conception, we have to say that in a sense it takes to perfection a great idea that inspired the thought of the 18th century, the idea of harmony, or harmony as idea. This concept is born from music, or rather from the close contact between materialist philosophy and music in the 18th century. The history of ideas has little to say on this paradox. Harmony appears as a reality that is palpable, hearing, rational based on numbers and relationship, and technological, with new instruments, the harpsichord, then the pianoforte. It adds a new dimension to music, or, more exactly, it recognizes a dimension already existing in musical practice, especially in the West, hence the three dimensions of melody, rhythm and harmony. The latter lends itself to great vertical constructions, utilizing chords and textures, harmonics, whereas melody and rhythm follow horizontal lines. The various voices, the elaboration and development of harmony, in the 18th century, gave rise to new musical genres, the symphony, among others, which superimposes the ascending and descending verticality of chords and textures onto the horizontality of voices. In the fugue, harmony maintains and retains in a totality its elements and moments, directions, intervals, voices, rhythmic elements, chords, various instruments and their timbres, etc. To each moment taken separately it adds a reflexivity. The elements are in relation with themselves in the ensemble. All correspond to one another in the harmonic construction. Each reflects the other and they all reflect the unity of the ensemble. This makes for Thebauti, of a symphony by Mozart or Beethoven. The idea of harmony can fade into sentimentality, that of the beautiful soul, which Hegel so hated, but is exalted in great musical constructions. Hegel himself, in his Aesthetics, characterizes his age, that of Romanticism, by the domination of music. In a certain sense, the great philosophical systems of the late 18th and early 19th centuries strive to embody the idea of a cosmic or human social harmony, just as does Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. This assertion needs a certain qualification. It is more true for Fourier than for Saint Simon, for the theories of economic harmony than for the naturalists, more for Hegel than for Kant. And it is also more true of the phenomenology, a real symphony of the spirit, than for the severe philosophy of right. The unconditioned universal that the phenomenology seeks to achieve, or reveal, still tolerates differences in an overall movement that is not yet reducible to the ensemble of a movement, in the figure of the content, the moments of the aspect under which they were initially presented, to be on the one hand a universal milieu of multiple subsisting materials, and on the other, a reflected place 120 in which their independence is dissolved. This phrase analyses the movement of a symphony in Hegelian terms. It describes a moving, in both senses, dialectical animation. We have to do justice to Hegel, so as to motivate and strengthen the fundamental criticism. He perceived his vertical construction as a sovereign harmony rather than a broad political thought, an intellectual symphony in which the philosopher is the author and the political leader, monarch, the conductor. He saw and defined himself as a liberal, champion of a constitutional monarchy. If we imagine Hegel faced with the political events of the 20th century, he would probably say something like this: the modern state swings between two extremes, corruption, disintegration, conflicts between the various powers that ensue from the decomposition of power and the authoritarian rigidity, military, fascist and reactionary fetishism of the leader. As theorist of the state, philosopher and political thinker, I have defined a position of relative equilibrium and regulated functioning. Around this position the political balance leans to one side or the other. It inevitably returns to the state as supreme consciousness of society, more and better than arbiter or arbitrary, synthesis of moments, site of policed harmony, to which we can immediately reply, dear philosopher, you prove as you always wish to and believe you prove, that your state inevitably departs from equilibrium and returns to it only with difficulty. You reveal a social body that has removed itself from nature and the natural body, and risen towards abstraction. This state that you erect as an absolute so dominates the hierarchy over which it presides that a day comes when it exploits the whole society and uses it for its own account. We call this Bonapartism or fascism unless it fragments, and we have a political crisis. For the philosopher, biological life and alienation of the idea, but a moment of disalienation forms part of logic, as an element. In the theory of Hegelian logos, there is a convergence between autodynamism, which presupposes life, and 21 rational structure, which implies coherence. The living, the result of being, remains stable, preserves its energy, maintains its conditions. It has in it the three moments of activity, objects and conditions. Life produces and reproduces itself. In biological reproduction, there is simply an extension of the act of production and perpetual reproduction of itself, which ceases only with death. The state, as earthly divinity, is thus also the supreme living being. Hegel would adopt, in the modern vocabulary, the concepts of auto-regulation and reproduction. He would reject the concept of automatism, and still more the image of the great machine. Organic life, at the level of the absolute, would be irreducible to a mechanical automaton. And yet, should we take the philosopher at his word? He also demands trust, faith. Why grant him this? Does not the identification presupposed between the ardent life of a symphony, the animal life of an organism and the internal life of the state, abuse this metaphor? Even a dragon has an internal life, and monsters lack neither grandeur nor beauty. Let us hear what Hegel declares about the idea and the state. Everything turns on grasping and expressing the true, not only a substance, but equally a subject. The living substance is being which is in truth subject, or, what is the same, is in truth actual only in so far as it is the movement of positing itself. Thus the life of God in divine cognition may well be spoken of as a disporting of love with itself, but this idea sinks into mere edification, and even insipidity, if it lacks the seriousness, the suffering, the patience, and the labor of the negative. 22. Is there not something ominous and disturbing in this passage from the phenomenology? What exactly is this seriousness, the labor of the negative, as opposed to the second negation in Engels and Marx, which strengthens the first and completes its work? The Hegelian negative seems to deny negation, to reject it into appearance, with contradiction and dialectic. It works in the positive, seeking a certain result. But what should we say of this passage from the philosophy of right? Individuality manifests itself here in the state as a relation to other states. This autonomy embodies mind's actual awareness of itself as a unit, and hence it is the most fundamental freedom which a people possesses and its highest dignity. This is therefore the moral ethical moment of war. It is a moment wherein the substance of the state makes the nullity of these finite things, life, property, and their rights, an accomplished fact. No, Hegel did not clearly discern what is disturbing in these declarations. A century and a half of political experience casts a different light on them from what they have in his conception. 6. The state, in major countries, major in terms of their strength, the smaller ones eagerly following in their wake, has become so complex that its protagonists, high officials and political leaders, no longer have cognition of it. Their entourage of advisors, public or private, suffers a division of labor, which can be inconvenient for knowledge and domination of the all. This political summit and its surrounds, in the Hegelian model, are supposed to cognize the whole and consequently understand the conflicts and contradictions of the ensemble in order to bring a solution to these sooner or later. Can they still do this? If they rule it, is this not from afar and too high? It is hard therefore to say whether the modern state conforms to the Hegelian stereotype or differs from it, so that this model only retains its interest as an ideal type, even just a brand image. What is hard to deny, however, is that the state, almost everywhere, has monopolized or tried to monopolize its entire space in order to control it, and likewise knowledge, to use this as a means of both management and controlled integration of the parts and elements of the political ensemble. We know that capitalism and the state based on this mode of production have absorbed pre-capitalist formations, agriculture, the life of the towns, and institutions, universities, courts, not forgetting the extensions of capitalism, leisure, housing, largely. by using knowledge, information, the so-called human sciences, if legal aspects have been modified, and there is now a right to work, to trade unions, rights that are more or less codified, those of children, women, old people, tenants, users, etc. We know that the fundamental principles, the very ones that enabled this codification, have not changed in the capitalist countries, and especially not in France. The right to property, the rules of inheritance and transmission of assets. Besides, these rights have as their counterpart the competence of the state in sectors and domains that formerly escaped it. By introducing these possibilities of conflict, the different rights and new institutions have extended the state's capacity for intervention. Such interventions, whether sporadic or total, have constantly grown, and the improvements to the contractual system, apparent or real, have not diminished the omnipresence and supposed omniscience of the state. On the contrary, it turns out that politicians, including those of the bourgeois state in capitalist society, have assimilated the theory of growth, glimpsed by Hegel and elaborated by Marx. Hegelians, without knowing it, or even sometimes knowing it, have understood to a large extent the conditions for growth, in particular the indispensable objects, capital, technology, investment, and the necessary activities, studies of opinions, markets and investments, motivations, orientation or planning. They have gone so far on this road as to adopt without further examination the theory of infinite growth, demographic, economic, technological, scientific, cultural, for each nation state, even when objections and obstacles, and debts that fall due, pile up on the global scale. The state, as a consequence, misunderstands knowledge by absorbing it and becoming an ideological power. Religion often, and morality always, serve to dissimulate the projects pursued by politicians. This use of ideology cannot conceal the other aspects of state power, its stranglehold on space and knowledge, the institutionalization of both of these, the ideological apparatuses, of the state explain nothing by themselves. The use of ideology indicates contradictions in a nascent or developed state within knowledge, cognition and ideology, the result being that the Hegelian brand image no longer corresponds to the state reality, without going so far as to contradict itself, since morality, ethics, is as much part of the Hegelian construction as is law. The ideological power of the state enables it to capture and divert certain important aspects of cognition, information, which is not the same thing, and identification of these aspects, which constitutes an ideology, and this in the manner of propaganda and advertising. A new holy trinity emerges: knowledge, constraint, ideology. The state, by controlling and distributing information, betrays the knowledge that legitimizes it in the Hegelian model. New categories are needed for it, those of Marxism, as we shall go on to see, the great strength of Hegelianism, the advantage it has over other philosophies that seek to be scientifically epistemologically based, is to have explained what we can call the rise of the modern world towards abstraction, a development whose full scope remains to be understood. For Hegel, logos, language, images and metaphors, at the level of common sense and understanding, then elaborated concepts and theories oversees and organizes this transformation. This world diverges from nature and the natural, from immediacy and spontaneity, irremediably so, and this movement defines a degree of freedom, or better still, the rational freedom of the Zoon politician. Marx would go further in this direction, by analyzing, in the wake of the English economists, how and why objects themselves, as products of labor, acquire an abstract existence as exchangeable. The good destined for exchange, the commodity, temporarily loses its material existence. Suspended in this way, it gives way to an abstraction, evaluation in money. Marx pressed further than Hegel the critical analysis of these concrete abstractions. He alone understood the importance of this Hegelian conception, which attributes a mode of existence to the concept. 2. Knowledge, to what is exchanged, products and goods, language and signs. The other Hegelians searched on the side of the subject in self-consciousness, combining the critique of abstract philosophy with that of a political economy which accepted and enumerated facts and observations. Marx counted among these concrete abstractions labor itself, viewed globally as average social labor. These abstractions, like money, have a concrete existence because they govern social relations despite being concealed beneath the appearances of materiality and immediacy. They determine the mode of existence of these. Since relationships cannot possess the same reality as things or substances, as Hegel understood, these abstractions are forms, endowed with an effectiveness in relationships in the same way as are the logical forms of calculation and language. Things immediately given, needs, activities, become abstractions by becoming social entities and means. A general movement, from bottom to top, thus presses the ensemble towards abstraction. Evidence or proof of this is given by the effectively growing role of social knowledge, particularly mathematical knowledge, and by contracts, an elaborated legal form, written rights that lay down reciprocal commitments for the respective parties. Moreover, with finance capital that is predominant today, money attains a kind of second-degree abstraction. It tends to detach itself still further from the material object of production, from commodities, from buying and selling, to become money that produces and reproduces itself in speculation, which some people express by saying that the sign acquires greater importance than the real. True, but when Marx extended and deepened the Hegelian conception in this way, he reached a conclusion incompatible with Hegelianism. The state itself is a concrete abstraction. It possesses neither the existence of a subject nor that of a substance. It is not sufficient unto itself, and perhaps not even necessary. It also demands a foundation. The summit does not hold up without a support, without a base. When Hegel assumes that knowledge power holds the social ensemble together, like the closed fist holds a net, he is way off course. There are no relations without supports. But after Hegel, and even after Marx, the question of support remains open. It is hard to accept, as do positivists and empiricist logicians, the existence of relationships without supports, as if it was enough for a relationship to be given mathematical form, YF, X, for it to become entirely visible. This alignment of social existence to physical existence, and of the latter to mathematical existence abstraction in its pure state dissolves differences between reality and cognition without establishing a real unity, except by reduction. When Hegel attributes existence and action to the concept, to knowledge, he is trying to speak of concrete abstraction, but he leaves the idea in midair, attaching it to the celestial transcendence of the idea. As for Marx, he gives it practice as its support, which is certainly correct, yet insufficient. How does immediate practice change into mediation? How does it bear abstraction without losing its effectiveness? What is the relationship between practice and logic form? To state right away our general conclusion, we will repeat a hypothesis put forward elsewhere. The support of social relations is space. We understand by this not epistemological, logico-mathematical space, nor the mental space of common sense and everyday discourse, but rather social space, as this is elaborated and constructed practically by different societies in the 23 course of their genesis. The most abstract finance capital, that of multinational corporations, cannot dispense with sites of registration and documents, investment, transfer between national currencies, etc. It is not completely distinct from flows attaching to terrains and territories, and yet, beyond the world of commodities, beyond production, even beyond signs themselves, it attains a second degree abstraction, all the more disturbing and ominous in that it can seize on a strategically chosen site, either for investment or for political overthrow, reactionary and fascist. This obscures the theoretical problem. The planet lives under the stormy clouds of concrete abstraction, in the shadow of recent forms of finance capital, both opaque like substances and superreal like concepts, and without agreement between nation-states, even in conflict with them. At this level the attachment of money, capital, to materiality, to production itself, is no more than sporadic, in philosophical terms, both necessary and yet contingent. It gives way to another attachment, that of the money abstraction to its actualization, the will to power. The globalization of economics and politics has taken these strange forms, unforeseeable in Hegel's time, unintelligible in terms of his categories, and yet extending these. Hegel believed and said that he thought Weltgeschichtlich at the level of world history. Was he wrong? No, he constructed the most general concepts. He forged the keys to modernity. Was he right? No, as the future did not happen as he had predicted. And to understand it we have to draw on Marx, and also, paradoxically, on Nietzsche, analyst of the will to power. 7. Analysis and explanation can now go further than the statist critique of the Hegelian state. That critique was content to say, no, the personnel in power, bureaucrats, technocrats, high officials, decision makers, all these people are not really familiar with the social ensemble. The instances that exist today, in the real possess neither the vocabulary, nor the concepts, nor the theory that is needed. So, let us replace them by new people who will know. The modern state is no longer Hegelian, in the sense that there is a division of power, not in a sense that would vindicate Montesquieu against Hegel, with various powers, a triad, naturally, legislative, executive, judiciary, denouncing and pronouncing against the unitary power and sovereign instance at the summit. Certainly not in this sense, as another triad has appeared on the scene in the last 10 or 15 years. Power, with capital sometimes below it but more often above it, is divided between the military, politicians and technocrats. Since Hegel's time, the political class has lost its assigned place, priority in the edifice and its property, homogeneous rationality. How rapidly it has disappeared. This famous rational unity between public, power and law, and what should we think of the no less rational unity that Hegel describes between justice and morality? The least that can be said is that the unity has become conflictual. Paradoxically, in other words, contradictorily, politics as such is devalued as the master key to the building, but is given greater value on the strategic level, that of decision making. The political machines that political professionals run are themselves diversified. Parties and apparatuses. They speak, they secrete ideology, rhetorical discourse, they manipulate, possessing the means required. They maneuver according to the needs of a political interest, that of an apparatus, itself bound up with a class or a fraction of a class, a group that has a certain weight. Politicians are supposed to decide. They correspond to the executive power. In fact, they either execute one another, or they execute their opponents. The decision makers settle matters, situations and heads. It is not always politicians that decide. They make use of decision makers, straw men, backups, sometimes verbally, sometimes materially. Too many political corpses to count. The technocrats correspond to the Hegelian portrait of a stratum that emerges from the middle class, selectively recruited by way of competition, examinations, degrees, who in this way gain knowledge, competence and performance, and power. However, co-optation tends to replace selection. If the competent and the experts manage the nation like a big firm, nothing guarantees the disinterestedness that Hegel believed. The cursus honorum is not enough to satisfy individuals. Virtue and competence do not necessarily go together, and today the Hegelian would be seen as naive. The technocrats also seek instruments of power. If money leads to power, sometimes the knowledge that leads to power also leads to money. They also divide and multiply, or, if you prefer, they multiply by dividing, by generating a hierarchy. There are bureaucrats, middle and top executives, and finally managers, those close to people who have both money and power, who decide strategically. This trilogy does not function without frictions, so much so that almost everywhere the military await the occasion, the moment, when knowledge, wealth and power, the power of politicians, weaken, to replace it with power in the raw sense, violence, with the result that the answer to the enigma, the puzzle and the mystery of this construction that appears rational is not to be found in transcendental logos, the idea, but in violence, latent or unveiled. The army, stuffed with explosives, bedecked with killing machines and explosive in itself, has more need to kill than a male full of sperm has to ejaculate. Will submission to uniform and dictatorship last a long time? No state is without its army, which prefers civil war to foreign internal contradictions apart. When the violence presided over by the state is unleashed, waged rationally with military procedures, it goes as far as genocide. And here we are still further from Hegelian rationality. The nation-state today exists only in the context of global strategies. These strategies are multiple, those of the most powerful states, but also those of multinational corporations, those of energy, oil, nuclear, etc. A nation-state is today simply a more or less important piece on the planetary chessboard, hence the increased importance of national territory space. This figures in the international division of labor. Its importance is a function of its resources. In other words, its particularities. It is the stake, objective. or target, of tactical and strategic operations. At the same time, a nation-state is of no importance taken in isolation. How can it be seen, as Hegel did, as the figure and embodiment of the universal? How can the result of an often mediocre history be honored with this status? Not every state has 10 or 20 centuries of wars behind it. Rationality takes on a different guise and form when situated in the global context of strategies. Virtual violence at every level, multiple risks, settlement dates that are closer or less close. Was Hegel right? Yes, when he showed the nation-state as a being, giant or dwarf, struggling for its life. No, when he placed this existence under the sign of absolute reason. We could conclude that the reproduction of moments, that is, of constitutive relations, does not attain and will never attain within the state the automatism dreamed of by Hegel in his rational raving. But perhaps it is still too soon to draw a conclusion. 8. The affinity that political reflection traces between state capitalism and state socialism reveals a great poverty of such reflection, a dubious method that highlights homologies and analogies instead of seeking to bring out the differences. State capitalism and state socialism differ, like all particular societies and nation-states, in the context of their particular mode of production. Here a classification of Hegelian origin is appropriate. Temporary singularities and lasting particularities have their place, then general categories, and finally, if there is need to appeal to these, universals. To make this clear, the singular features of peoples and ethnicities, the history of each nation, its characteristics of social and spatial origin, geographic, geopolitical, the specific moments of its state, then the mode of production, a general determination, and finally the legal and formal relations, a universal aspect of every society. State capitalism and state socialism have a common aim and interest, growth. In both cases, political leaders have maintained against all objections the assumption of infinite growth, a remarkable assumption that for them has the certainty of scientific knowledge. They obtain the growth made immediately possible by different procedures, bound up with the differences, particularities and specificities signaled above. State capitalism gives the big firms their head. In the extreme case, the state plays just an advisory role, their databank, placing knowledge and information at their service. But the rulers of the capitalist state are permanently in a difficult position, caught between national and multinational firms, small and giant industry, commerce at every level and size, money and credit, etc. State socialism has no hesitation in centralizing and planning by authoritarian means. It is closer to Hegel's great machine, except that it functions neither automatically nor in a satisfactory manner. Neither the knowledge of its rulers, nor that of their advisors, covers the totality even with the aid of calculating machines, whose support for the great machine is certainly not negligible. And here is the caricature side of the situation, familiar to everyone but whose comic aspect few appreciate. On the capitalist side, the economy is in the driving seat, constantly under threat but up to now free of global crisis. On the so-called socialist side, politics is alone in the driving seat. One surprising paradox among others is that Marx, appealed to by the side, had proclaimed the opposite. What is working well? Political life? No. Life is lacking. Everything works through politics. But without life, is there ever political life that is neither caricature nor in opposition? On both sides, capitalist and socialist, social life has disappeared, crushed between economics and politics, the former predominant here and the latter there, an enormous void, filled by everyday life, the family, so-called private relationships. That is deprived of scope, deprived of creative capacity, a situation that conforms to the Hegelian model, which misunderstands the moment of specifically social relations and subordinates these to political rationality and economic management, with the result that these relations are impoverished and reduced to the family and everyday life, to morality and law, a constricted lived experience, in brackets, vegetates in the shadow of the state. Hegelians, whether conscious or not, for whom their model of the state represents a position of balance between the excesses and effects of public authority, these same Hegelians may claim that their model also represents the common measure, the highest common factor, between that state of advanced state capitalism and that of socialism in the course of economic growth. Shall we please them by noting other common moments, the importance of the police and bureaucracy, culture given official status as ideology, crass quantitativism, growth without development of social relations, the destruction of differences. 9. The Hegelian model sins not by ignorance but by misunderstanding social classes. It is a further paradox that it should have endured despite this deficiency, maintaining prestige and influence despite, or perhaps, because of, Marxist critique. A certain recent book, ambitious and already outdated, would provide a certain satisfaction for the ironist if read in the doubtful 24 light of its Hegelian reference. Very likely, so-called Marxist critique, still in an embryonic state with Marx himself, has committed some serious mistakes. It has even misunderstood the Hegelian model, its import, its restricted yet powerful rationality. A certain left, or, if you like, leftist, critique mixes up and confuses everything: reaction, fascism, authoritarianism, liberalism, military intervention, under the simplifying labels of class dictatorship, violence, power, to the political schema diffused by bourgeois ideology, which presents the state as neutral, which very poorly corresponds to Hegel's theoretical model. The oppositional ideology replies with polemics, class justice, class teaching, class science, etc. In a word, dictatorship. The concept of hegemony attenuates and completes what is rather too summary in the concept of dictatorship, of the bourgeoisie. There is a hegemony of the economically dominant class, which means that this acts and struggles to control the entire society, to shape it according to its needs. The bourgeoisie has the basis of its domination in firms, production, and the market, which it is ever more familiar with, as this is dependent on it and its strategy. Now, a society, with the social relations it implies, is reducible neither to economics or politics. In a society, there are public services, education and teaching, justice, medicine. There is the organization of knowledge, and its transmission and use. The various aspects and moments of social life date from pre-capitalist times, uninterrupted by any sudden break, in modern society. There is also urban life, and the complex relationship between town and country. Nature, the bourgeoisie struggles for its hegemony, that is, to mark with its imprint and bend to its use these moments of social relations, of practice and social life. It succeeds in this only with difficulty. Its class struggle extends to the totality, far beyond the economy, the firm or questions of wages. The social ensemble is not bourgeoisified in advance, prefabricated by capitalism, and the state, a means, as much and more so than an end, an instrument rather than a pinnacle. This permits the management of the social surplus product, that substantial part of surplus value, in non-Marxist terms, of the national income, that goes to various services, to society as such. For Hegel, this management, this extension of the state to the whole of society, is taken for granted. These are integral and integrating parts of the concept of the state, a serious mistake, only up to a point. In fact, this mistake is made even by a large section of politicians, including those coming from the economically dominant class and representing this politically. For them, power is sufficient. They tend to neglect the hegemonic role, despite this being assigned to them by their class. This was the folly of the French bourgeoisie for a long period, to despise knowledge and almost systematically erode the funds required for the general management of society except in relation to some preferential sectors, for example roads and primary schools for the Third Republic. Analysis of modernity from the Hegelian point of view refutes both the full and complete rationality of this model and the opposite point of view of a dictatorial absurdity maintained simply by violence, conducted correctly. This critical analysis starts from an examination of social management. The hegemonic class does not by a long way do just what it would like to do, as everyday life and lived experience partly escape it, dominated and impoverished as they might be. It is also limited even politically by the democracy that it had itself established. How does it distribute the surplus product that the state disposes of? By what channels? Whom does it favor? For what purpose? And by what tactic? And what exactly escapes it? Along with lived experience and everyday life, sex, pleasure and love escape this political undertaking. And so does everything that is defined as offense, crime or madness, drug use, forbidden gambling. Then there is poetry, music and theater. In other words, art to the extent that they create something new. Artists escape the grip of the state, the institutional net. In other words, the errant and aberrant, the anomic, with the underlying paradox of a genuine autonomy within hegemony. Only the anomic, the aberrant, has a creative capacity. Lived experience is repressed and falls into unconsciousness, from which it again rebels. It beats its path in the shadow, and if it can, breaks out by inventing, creating. The analyst may despair at comparing the power of the state, its hegemonic capacities, with the weakness of what escapes it, and yet, the slightest breach and smallest crack compromise the solidity of the edifice, a fragility familiar to skilled politicians, and to their henchmen in the police, who pursue certain offenses as significant. Men with long hair. The state eradicates what it can do without, but what society finds it hard to do without, and what civilization absolutely cannot. A remarkable accident or revelation of a higher rationality, as something of growing importance, possible even decisive, increasingly escapes the hegemonic omniscience and omnipresence of the state. What? An irrationality, as some people believe? No. Space. Too complex. Too many people and places and things. Yet nothing is more normal, more essential, in short, more rational. Here again, we lay our cards on the table rather than maintain suspense. Space introduces a contradiction within the edifice. In other words, more than a fissure, and different from a challenge to state political rationalism by the irrational. Despite the efforts of technicians and technocrats, there is a risk of knowledge rapidly escaping the administrative and political apparatuses of the state, as far as space is concerned. 10. Hegel described the ennui resulting from the satisfaction of needs that have found without too great effort the object they require, of functions that correctly proceed towards their goal, of duty accomplished. He showed the mechanism by which each satisfaction is matched by a malaise, removed from the immediacy of natural desire. Needs become increasingly artificial, abstract. To each need corresponds an object. By consuming the object, by destroying it, need destroys itself. Hence a void that is filled by another need, in turn provoking another void. What emerges is simply the system of needs. Hegel analyzed the malaise, though without detecting its bourgeois guise. He proved the importance of the system of needs, to a point that we may wonder whether philosophy does not conceal a diabolical libido dominandi, or whether libido scendi does not provide a satisfaction superior to all other pleasures. What irony! The theorist of the state already announced and denounced in advance the deadly ennui, grey on grey, twilight, gloomy and cold. He embodied it in the pedantry of the philosopher, a functionary who utters philosophical discourse in the manner of the Lenten sermons of the Middle Ages, a public service. This is what Hegel did not say. The state sullies, kills, destroys everything it touches, everything that does not manage to escape. Nothing can resist it, neither talent, nor spontaneity, nor style. Its hygiene well conceals its pollution, but prevents fertility, which the state reserves for its subjects, women. The market in cognition or art has more than one disagreeable side. It does not sterilize in the way that the state does, by the award of niggardly grants. For Hegel, the state perfects the creative capacity of knowledge, infinite in the finite. It brings time to an end by establishing itself in space. On the contrary, the state kills whatever tries to go further, and space overflows its competence, finite by essence, which thus meets its end in the principle of its self-destruction. However, we should guard against attributing it an absolute originality. Before the philosophico-political state, was there not the theologico-political state, which has left its traces? In Rome, the pontifical state oversaw a deadly ennui for centuries, a legitimized barbarism that was already counted by the art of the Baroque, the strange, the informal, surrealism, non-realism or hyper-realism before the name. The crumbling and collapse of the modern edifice may bring about that of civilization and culture, society and science, and increasingly the planet itself, with the result that the self-destruction of the doomed state leads to the end of the earth and the death of the human species. In this respect, the present situation has an unprecedented seriousness and almost absolute originality inconceivable in historical terms. 11. Nothing happens simply. Hegel described in detail the unifying movement of knowledge power, emphasizing the domination of power over knowledge, the stranglehold of the political state over cognition and science. This movement runs from within to without, from the center to the periphery. But an opposite movement also exists. Knowledge demands its participation, its integration integration into the mechanisms and apparatuses of power, kernels of acquired knowledge, tied by connections at first hypothetical, then consolidated, gain official status by becoming institutionalized. This takes place in two ways: programs and programming. Philosophical consecration of the gains. Epistemology, when the philosopher accepts servitude, when he becomes a functionary and bureaucrat in exchange for paltry honors. Philosophy surrenders to political domination. But what does it offer? Knowledge, in other words. Philosophico-political logos may find allies and accomplices even among the possessors of knowledge. Strategic projects to institutionalize knowledge involve academic organization as well as the official predominance of a particular discipline that provides the central core, formerly history, then political economy, and more recently linguistics, the innovative character of these disciplines having only a ceremonial and declarative role. By their very failure, these attempts have revealed their political meaning, to line spiritual production and that of spirits with the reproduction of socio-political relations and the production of things, objects and goods, with a view to rationally totalizing the ensemble in a self-regulated automatic production according to a simple model, with political control over cognition and culture as well as education and teaching. If state power makes a grab for knowledge, a certain knowledge is defined by acceptance of this stranglehold, an acceptance that may see itself as free because it is voluntary, in the name of logos and logic. Any partial science that would be axle and central, and the science of discourse above all, continues Hegelian logos or seeks to rescue it. 12. The Hegelian fetishizing of the concept sets this up as the unalterable core of knowledge, the center of practical power, hence a constraint and violence, justified by knowledge. Concepts fight, because flesh and blood men fight by using them. With Hegelianism, Western logos thus reaches a point of both fulfillment and fall. This is not sufficient reason to cast the concept into the dustbin of history. The formal opposition of the conceived to live experience la concu or vicu, the evacuation of the vicu by the concu, may collapse, and the concept regain its place. There is a concept of the vicu as such. The content of the concept differs from its logical form, with the result that it may denote this difference instead of reducing it. The situation is reversed when Marx appears on the stage. On the other hand, if the opposition is seen as irreducible, if the vicu and the concu are incompatible and there is anyone willing to lead a rebellion of the one against the other, it is Nietzsche. Before tackling these dramatic scenes, the preceding analyses can be reduced to a terminological distinction. Against Hegel's unitary, totalizing conception, we can discern, in the site and place of a tautological circle that defines knowledge by the real and the real by knowledge, knowledge, institutional, official, consecrated as an assured gain id epistemology, and thus frozen and fixed, logicized, pedagogized, purchasable and saleable, ever threatened with recycling, always on the edge of 25 falling into the abyss of the past epist, a strange mixed state between being, becoming, nothingness, be, cognition, a process, including the critical moment critical of society, ideology and knowledge itself, aiming, either immediately or through mediation, at their ensemble, a totality, thus extending philosophy by extracting itself with difficulty from ideologies, by linking up with a practice, thus as metaphilosophy, capital A. Promethean situation, with the result that theoretical cognition does not claim to be sufficient, though not ceasing to see itself as necessary. It thus becomes the site of a combat, see, science, or rather the sciences, specialized disciplines, hence partial but operative, forming part of the division of labor and thus the market for knowledge or state of apparent security, yet actually involved in a process of unequal birth and uneven development, sometimes in a position of priority with imperialist pretensions, sometimes in decline and subordinated. The Marx file 1. Hegel sought to attain, and believed he had attained, the objective of every philosopher since Aristotle, the aim of all philosophy, the perfect system, a completed and thus closed ensemble, encompassing the whole world, cohesion and coherence, thus column, pillar, axis. The precise terms and the metaphors both say one and the same thing. Dogmatism, pedantry, a ponderous spirit. These severe words also say the same thing, and yet genius, if this word still has a meaning. It was enough for the Hegel file to retrace the profile of Hegelianism, as this had itself been changed by a century and a half of posterity. If we were to go into the detail of its influence, long volumes would not be sufficient. To a large extent, Marx and Marxism would figure in this file. The reader would find both Bismarck and Lassalle, the vaguely rational French evolutionism of the 19th century after Victor Cousin, Renan and Taine, and Italian historicism, Croce. As for those who were Hegelians without knowing it, the file would never be complete, as it would have to contain statesmen of all kinds. Only one point has real importance. The system block had to persevere in its dogmatic being, or collapse at a single blow. Now, Hegelianism, like any system or supposed system, crumbled and fragmented after Hegel himself. This process brought to light lines of cleavage, fissures in the edifice that were initially invisible. Panlogicism and panhistoricism were products of fragmentation, since they indicated right away a lack of harmony between these moments. Coherence and contradiction, succession and simultaneity, becoming and spatial coexistence, logic and dialectic, were never really connected in the apparently monolithic system. Later philosophy sought in vain, after the death of the supreme philosopher, another way, a third way, we could say, beyond this paradigm of highly pertinent oppositions, by the intervention of a third term, consciousness. This was postulated as a unitary existence in place of the idea. It was supposed to contain both a logic and a history, an objectivity and a subjectivity. In this specifically philosophical posterity, the political, whether reflection or practice, was of little account. Hegelianism followed the fate of the philosophies it believed it had united and superseded by realizing them, a speculation disconnected from practice. Our Hegel file here deliberately omitted the history of Hegelianism. Why not? In order to proceed to a confrontation between the Hegelian statue of the state and the reality of the modern state. Without further delay, is the same procedure applicable to Marx? Probably not. First of all, because there is no such thing as Marxism, whereas the existence of Hegelianism is undeniable. Contrary to even the most widespread opinion, Marxism was invented by Marxists who looked for a system in the thought and work of Marx: materialism, economism, theory of history, theory of determinism and freedom, etc., and proceeded to invent one. Though Marx's thought is in no way incoherent and disparate, it does not have the form of a system. It broke with what went before, without opposing one body of doctrine to others. The philosophical works of the young Marx are no less important than the economic works of his maturity or the political works of his last years. It has been said that the concept of alienation, which Marx borrowed from Hegelianism and which inspired the works of his youth, does not possess a theoretical status. That is perfectly true. This philosophical concept hangs in midair once detached from the Hegelian architecture, and yet, it is a sign of supreme pedantry to reject it on these grounds and refuse it the status of a concept. It has a social status, not an epistemological one. It has played a remarkably fermenting role, inexhaustibly fertile, in the cognition, taking consciousness, as is misguidedly said today, of practical conditions, those of workers, of women, of young people, of the colonized, and the colonizers. Do we need to go on? If this fertility is exhausted, that is not sufficient reason to misunderstand it. Marx revealed in his own fashion, in practical conditions, in the VQ of lived experience, misunderstood triad, exploitation, oppression, humiliation. These three terms go together, while remaining distinct. They form part of the designation and connotation of a single term, alienation. The concepts of surplus value and surplus product have a scientific and hence epistemological status. They form part of acquired knowledge. True, but they pertain to economics, a particular science, and besides, no one makes the concept of surplus value a matter of life and death, whereas countless human beings have fought, and still fight, against humiliation and oppression, which are the ways they experience exploitation. Second, Marx's theoretical projects remained incomplete and imperfect. His so-called philosophical works do not contain a philosophy, or another model of theoretical elaboration, but rather a project, that of superseding philosophy. His economic studies on accumulation, limited to England, do not give a full understanding of the cumulative process, despite revealing the concept of this, clearly distinguishing the accumulation of capital from the Hegelian accumulation of knowledge. Capital and its preparatory texts and appendices come to an end, and finished, at the point where Marx draws a picture of capitalist society, with its multiple classes, class fractions and social strata grouped between and around the two poles of proletariat and bourgeoisie, agriculturalists, artisans, traders, landed proprietors, etc. At the point of transition to the concrete, to social practice, the exposition is broken off. As for the state, Marx said and repeated before Lenin that this was the key problem, the essential question. The sum total of his works contains only a sketch of a theory of the state. In the course of successive trials, by way of polemics and pamphlets, a single trenchant assertion is repeated. The state must be destroyed, and not exalted and consolidated in the tradition of Hegel. How to realize the strategic objective, how to bring to reality the anticipating vision, concrete utopia, of a society freed from its oppressive state overlay. Throughout his life, as we shall go on to see, Marx sought the means, stages, moments of this action that defined the revolution. Neither the anarchistic trashing of existing reality, nor a superseding effected within the liberal bourgeois state, nor a VQ transcending rationality, humanism and liberalism, would achieve this result. It could only be projected on a different path, that of a multifarious struggle, polyvalent rather than simply economic, or simply ideological and theoretical. Third, this incomplete, broken, imperfect character of Marx's thought paradoxically explains Marxism and its successes. Collections of texts, more or less cleverly selected and fitted together, gave the appearance of an original thought, a doctrine attributed to Marx. These successive systems serve as alibis and masks. In the wake of Lassalle, and along with many others, Stalin called himself a Marxist and effectively bent Marx's words and concepts to his own use. He replaced the Marxist critique of the state, reprised and emphasized by Lenin and the state and revolution, with the super-Hegelianism, an unconditional apologia for the state, a theory of its strengthening. Hegelian logic was in full operation in Stalinist ideology and the practical construction of a system that imprisoned those who tried to escape from it. At the opposite extreme from this conception, Georg Lucas constructed his personal assemblage of Marxist texts with a view to drawing from them a speculative historicism, uselessly open to the possible history and class consciousness, historicism, economism, theory of productivity and planning, theories of determinism, economic, historical, sociological, thus used Marx's texts and twisted them into a different meaning, that of an era, a country, a school or a thinker. Does this mean that we should reduce Marx to the dimensions of a brilliant essayist? No. His texts contain more than exciting suggestions, and something other than a system. What they contain is better, a vocabulary, a terminology, a language, as many eminent minds would say, different from current language and everyday discourse, yet unlike the discourses developed by specialists, economists, historians, sociologists, etc., or philosophers. It is very different to speak of surplus value, rather than profit. Marx described, analyzed and explained existing society differently from how it perceives and conceives itself, the way it lives without understanding itself. The terms and terminology he used put an end to the customary representations, stereotypes, verbiage, background noises and accompaniment of this political economic reality. Marx was not content with words, he pursued them to the level of concepts, and assembled these into theories. Why did he not complete any of the theoretical constructions he undertook? Lack of time? Lack of material? Lack of method? No. Understanding. Aims to attain an all, or even the all, but the all slips from reach. The critical moment, intervening both in against the constructions underway and against in, the object of cognition, shatters the edifice before it is complete. The real changes during the analysis. By the time of synthesis it has already changed. A scrupulous exposition can only proceed cautiously by signaling the way, showing the horizon, and so, by twisting his thought and assembling his texts. Many Marxists have even used Marx's own language, a different language from the everyday discourses of the bourgeoisie scholars and thinkers. As a young man, still almost adolescent, Karl Marx criticized Hegel for his grotesque craggy melody, and yet he dived into the sea of Hegel's philosophy. philosophy, sensing that Hegelian doctrine was based only on postulates and presuppositions. He then wrote a long dialogue, proceeding to a philosophical dialectical account of divinity, as it manifests itself as the idea in itself, as religion, as nature, and as history. My last proposition was the beginning of the Hegelian system. Shortly after, Marx began to turn upside down the world in which the idea precedes the real and the divinity is incarnated in nature and history. He directly attacked Hegel's philosophy of right and the state. Hegelianism holds a prominent position in the German ideology 1845, in which Marx, impelled by Engels, threw the whole of philosophy overboard, seen as ideology. This raised serious questions, for example concerning the concept of truth elaborated by philosophers. In The Poverty of Philosophy, this condemnation excludes the Hegelian dialectic itself, apropos its first popularization in France by Proudhon, then a long silence. In 1857, working on Capitalism and Capital, Marx took up Hegelian logic and dialectic. In 1867, when Hegel's influence in Germany had fallen to the point that he was seen as a dead dog, Marx coquettishly used dialectic in Capital as a method of investigation, analysis and explanation. In 1875, against La Salle, as with his writings on the Paris Commune, he renewed with doubled force his attack on the Hegelian theory of the state. It would be possible to publish certain works by Marx, for example, the 7,844 manuscripts, setting opposite one another Hegel's paragraphs and their critique by Marx, as Marx himself did apropos Hegel's philosophy of the state. This would illustrate textually the dramatic image of perpetual struggle. In a famous fragment that openly had in mind Adam Smith and economic productivism, Marx wrote that the criminal produces crimes, in other words, law, judges, executioners and prisons, as well as detective stories and tragedies that punctuate for a moment the deadly ennui of bourgeois society and the state. Did he not surreptitiously have Hegel himself in mind, and his theory of the self-production of man and the state by knowledge? It follows that Marxism coincides only very little with the history of Marxism, a moment of a history that differs greatly from that which Hegel cognized and theorized, to the point that it is perhaps no longer a history in the accepted sense of this concept. Paradoxically, how many paradoxes have we not already encountered on this journey? Does it have to be repeated that paradox means a contradiction that is misconstrued, stifled, blunted? Marx waged a titanic struggle against with Hegel, like that of Hercules and Antaeus in the Greek myth. He seized from Hegel the materials, categories and concepts, themes and problems, for his systematic elaboration, first taken apart and then used fragment by fragment. The guerrillero Marx, for a long while accompanied only by Engels, then surrounded by uncertain and half-convinced allies ready to betray him, La Salle took from Hegelianism weapons that could be turned against it. He took this material, procedures, methods, triadic rhythms, reciprocal but poorly elucidated imbrication of logic and dialectic and vice versa, but with a radically different project, based on completely divergent propositions, a different perspective, a different path, and above all a path beyond the Hegelian achievement, that of philosophy, of thought, of history, of man in the state. After the death of Marx, the struggle continued, the same struggle, on the theoretical level, in cognition, with against Hegel and Hegelianism, to turn these weapons against them, and change the arm of criticism into the criticism of arms. In other words, to eradicate from the earth the harsh reality that Hegel presented and represented. A strange struggle, seemingly different from the class struggle, yet actually the same. A strange battle, in shadow and against a shadow, with the shadow of a giant, and against a giant in the shadow. Considered carefully, not a moment of this act dramatic beauty, that beauty which Andre Breton, speaking of something quite different, called convulsive frozen. In the course of the century that has elapsed since then, the diversion of Hegelianism by Marxism has followed its course towards exhaustion. Reversal of theoretical propositions has replaced reversal, in a slow but sure fashion. In the space where the contradiction develops, it follows from this that the Marx file is initially hard to distinguish from the Hegel file, yet it has its distinct features, and even differs from it radically. Another paradox, too. Marx is dead. This gloomy fact, erected into an ideological and political slogan, would have its place across among other tombs in the great modern cemetery. Death of God, of man, of art, of history, etc. Everything is dying around us, it seems, apart from the state, the only death that Marx explicitly proclaimed. Marx or Marxism? The death of Marxism has already been announced 100 times, and the good news is published in the right-minded press, whether by the political right or by a certain leftism, against the political stronghold of an orthodoxy caught between these fires. Almost half a century ago now, a certain Otto Rulli had his moment of fame by explaining Marx and Marxist thought as a product of liver disease, an explanation recently taken up, or almost so, by certain psychoanalysts. Ricardo was mentally and physically constipated. Marx suffered from diarrhea and therefore agorrhea. Soon after, Otto Rulli, a Belgian reformist, Henri had great success with a book on the theme Marxism is superseded. What Marxism? What's superseding? The Frankfurt School Marxists, on the other hand, such as Karl Korsch, found little audience with work that was far more elaborate. We can leave this alone. Every gravedigger attacks a certain Marxism, that which they find appropriate, and attributes it to Marx. Philosophism, voluntarist, revolutionism, class subjectivism, economism, productivism, etc. In the same years, the anarcho syndicalist tendency, deeply rooted in the French working class, openly accused Marx's works, and real or supposed Marxists, of dividing the working class, spontanists without having the concept. These anarchists violently attack theoretical thought. For them, knowledge and cognition, whatever their intentions, came from the bourgeoisie. From an initial general accusation, dividing the working class, they quickly passed to more threatening imprecations, enemy of the people, German thinkers or inspired by Germany, etc. If the interpretation of Marxism expressed here, which sums up a long series of previous works, is exact, then Marxism exists only in the form of an interpretation, not because Marx's thought was obscure or embryonic, but because it proclaimed and proposed projects, instead of asserting, apparently, confirming the fact facts and systematizing the accomplished. Like Hegelianism, facts and concepts served Marx for exploring the possible and impossible by way of theory. If he analyzed capitalism, if he exposed bourgeois society as a whole, it was to show its caducity. His strategic hypothesis inverted that of Hegel, pertaining as it did to the revolutionary overthrow of the upside-down world, as opposed to the frozen knowledge that seeks to legitimize the world. Like the economic base, social relations and other superstructures, the state is transformed as a function of contradictions and antagonisms that it can neither escape by ideology nor suppress by constraint, nor again resolve by political action within the system. Is this a postulate, a presupposition? Some will say that it is. But what cognition is possible without a strategic hypothesis, a starting point, a beginning? By what right can anyone maintain the permanence of a relationship, the imperishableness of a concept, the eternity of a fact? Two more remarks. The hypothesis of becoming, according to which nothing lasts in substance without transformation and leaps, without metamorphosis, was precisely the initial hypothesis of Hegel, taken from Heraclitus, of whom the philosopher says, in his History of Philosophy, that philosophy begins with Heraclitus, and subsequently dismissed. It was recognized ever since Parmenides that the idea of eternal becoming is not without its difficulties, that it comes up against the observation of definite beings, the concept of distinct and, relatively, stable realities. This was how the Eleatics replied to the followers of Heraclitus. For a philosopher who claimed allegiance to Heraclitus to move over to the Eleatic position is a serious matter. When Hegel still thought that with the French Revolution, man stood up and built reality with his head, in other words, with his thought, he believed in becoming and in dialectical reversals in the future. Later on, he immediately sterilized and put a stop to becoming. Marx took up the Heraclitean hypothesis, an underlying philosophy that an assertion not demonstrated and not demonstrable, accepted as such in cognition without explicitly saying so, compromising this and compromised by it, perhaps. But how to proceed otherwise? A different approach would immediately sterilize thought by preventing the least step forward. The Eleatic school, in the History of Philosophy, was unable to maintain its paradox, the arrest of movement for the sake of stability and equilibrium. Does its approach not lead to reducing everything to accounting, recording details, noting facts great and small while accepting the repetition of these facts, the mechanical reproduction of things, the flattening of the real, more Hegelian than Hegel, and yet profoundly anti-Hegelian? That is how the initial approach of Marx's thought may be defined. But this definition leads on to a general attitude towards facts, findings, even concepts. It becomes procedure, precept of reflection and action. Take each and everything by its changing and perishable side. Show that all stability, all equilibrium, all immobility is appearance. Emphasize becoming. Use the germs of destruction and self-destruction that all reality bears within itself. Is there not then a choice, an option, an act of will, at the bottom of this procedure? Yes, in a sense. And Marx opposed himself to Hegel on the basis of this very foundation. In the beginning, there is action and vor dietat. In the words of Faust, Marx in no way understood by this a gesture that displaces an object, but an action appropriate to the world, an act. Not an idea like the Hegelian idea. Is this voluntarism or pragmatism? No. Marx's strength is that he shows a logical coincidence of this political postulate with the imperative of thought and cognition as such. There is no cognition that does not insert the fact in a relationship, that does not integrate the finding in an ensemble, and that thus denies its isolation and envisages its modification, its transformation, its virtual disappearance. This is what Hegel declared of the dialectical method, when he explained it in strict terms. Not without difficulties in fact, for all thought, doubt or reflection, every act of cognition that is initially an act, a beginning is necessary, and nothing is harder than the beginning, as Hegel declares when he seeks this as far, as deeply and as abstractly as possible. Pure sensation, in the phenomenology, pure formal identity, in the logic, pure metaphysical origin, the idea. When Marx explained capitalism and bourgeois society, he sought the beginning of his presentation as far and as abstractly as Hegel, in the pure form of exchange value, in the commodity in general, in abstract, socially average, labor, but at the start of his critical reflection and his work, the beginning of action and thought, the initial act, are produced practically, in other words, politically, meaning by this word a terrain on which thought establishes itself and conducts its activity, hence its struggle, which leads to the critical examination of the political itself of actual politics. Pure philosophy ends in a blind alley. It divides into positivism, fetishism of the fact, the observation, or voluntarism, activity that claims to change the world without cognition of it. Marx's approach avoids the impasse. It does not fall into this dilemma and resolves the problem. At the beginning, there is practice, the act that posits and presupposes that the world can change because it does change and that inserts itself in social and political practice in order to guide this change. In the course of its history, with Hegel and others, philosophy attained the scale and scope of the world. It measured this and its problems. It became global. The philosopher who refuses to confirm the world as it is, in the way that positivism, empiricism and political realism do pragmatically, sees it changing. He wants therefore to realize philosophy, conceived as the project of a different world, the perspective and horizon of a higher and truer human reality. In what way is this philosopher going to realize philosophy? The philosopher falls silent, powerless. He goes back into himself and sterilely asserts his will. At this point, philosophy comes to an end and is superseded. As a consequence of what? Of the revolutionary postulate that raises cognition and active being to a higher level. A postulate, yes, and even a political postulate, once again necessary so that the antecedents, philosophy and knowledge, continue to preserve a meaning and an importance so that there are consequences, even if this continuation differs radically from what went before. As the world becomes philosophical, philosophy also becomes worldly. Its realization is also its loss. Marx wrote in 1839 in his doctoral thesis on the materialism of antiquity. The inaugural approach of Marx's thought refused and rejected both philosophy en bloc and Hegelianism as a compendium, summary, of all philosophy, but at the same time it extended these, carrying them to a higher level, with the result that philosophical concepts, reprised and modified for this purpose, can serve in the transformation of the world, as means rather than ends. The philosophical, epistemological, status of these concepts is thus replaced by a social status, connecting them to practice. The concept of alienation, for example, right at his beginning, the beginning of a multiple combat, Marx accused Hegel of realpolitik and almost even positivism, something Hegel detested, but this was to wrest from him the dialectic, giving this back the cutting edge of an offensive weapon. The dialectical approach was turned back against Hegelianism and against philosophy, analyzed in its final duplication, determined as a requirement of a metaphilosophical superseding. Marx is dead, they say. But how could such an approach disappear? Its beginning can always be newly resumed, with differences arising from the actual changes in the theoretical and practical situation, changes whose elucidation it makes possible. If there is a choice, it is between the attitude that works to close reality, to confine the accomplished within its limits, and action that seeks to open, expand, shift these limits and shatter them. The attitude that prohibits movement, philosophically associated with the Eleatics, is expressed in constricting decisions. Such an alternative still retains a full and complete meaning today, taken as an act that founds a cognition and a being, instead of seeking an origin elsewhere in the distant past, in a no less distant transcendence. Marx's approach is dateless. In fact and in truth, Marxism does not act in the modern world as a system already here, present like a rock. It acts like a germ, a ferment that this living being transforms itself. It spreads germs and ferments that diversify, that die or degenerate here or there, but prosper elsewhere. 3. Croaks are heard from the muddy ditch, and cawing from the grey sky. Marx is dead. Nothing that he predicted, proclaimed, prophesied, has been realized, nothing at all. This from the political right, from the left, more precisely the anarcho-Gorgias left. An interesting proposition has been put forward. If it had not been for Marx and Marxist theory, the proletarian revolution would already have happened. Marx says, protector of capitalism, and yet, peasant revolts did not bring about land reform. Machine breaking has never transformed society. This anarcho-Gorgiasm avoids a problem, an important conflict between institution and organization. If the question of inventory and balance sheet is raised, let us establish right away. Marx's writings contain a certain number of short-term forecasts or predictions, among others, the imminent, because already underway concentration of capital, its consequence being the end of competitive capitalism, which took place under a double pressure, that of the financial capital that arose from concentration, and that of the working class acting both on the economic level, strikes, wage increases, reduction in working hours, and on the political level, parliamentary action, subversive action, revolutionary action. Who today can deny the realization of this prophecy, based on the analysis of tendencies and contradictions inherent to the capitalism of free competition? Just by itself, the realization of a pronouncement on this key point would ensure the validity of Marx's analysis and explanation of capital. However, the validity of Marx's analyses was apparent only belatedly, once this transformation of competitive capitalism into monopolistic, imperialist and financial capitalism had taken place, and moreover through various interpretations, Hilferding, Lenin, Keynes, etc., and contradictory events. Recently, apropos the crisis in raw materials and energy, we have read, above authoritative signatures, various declarations of the kind. Unforeseen crisis unrelated to Marxist thought, with no relationship to the Marxist hypothesis of overproduction and underconsumption. Now Marx's theory of crises can be summed up in the assertion that every crisis has its specific characteristics. He himself studied in his own lifetime a crisis triggered by the scarcity of a major raw material, cotton, imported from the region of North America ravaged by the Civil War. Finally, the overproduction that Marx analyzed was above all that of means of production, machines, labor power. The disappearance of competitive capitalism took place, as Marx foresaw, through a double process: the pressure and action of the working class, which in 1917 undertook to replace this mode of production in large agricultural country, and the rise of financial capitalism in the advanced countries. A connection that matched Marx's overall predictions but did not match the details of these, as he had envisaged revolutionary transformation in the advanced industrial countries, under the leadership of a working class that was highly developed, both qualitatively and quantitatively. The hypothesis of such a political revolution preceded crisis by, and enabling via the transformation of property relations, a rapid growth, economic, and development, social, qualitative, thus turned out to be partially mistaken. Incontestably, according to Marx, there would not be growth in the productive forces without overturning social relations. Growth and development of society had to go rationally, harmoniously together, in a style that we might call Hegelian. Domination over nature and appropriation of nature could not, for Marx, be separated. The concatenation of facts, the victory of the Hegelian type of state over the revolutionary forces, would result in growth without development, victory of the quantitative over the qualitative, along with the flattening out of the social, crushed between the economic and the political. On the other hand, this generalized growth partially realizes the transitional period envisaged by Marx. It makes possible, which does not mean necessary, a qualitative leap, the contribution of social forces stifled up till now by repression, by the political use of knowledge, by ideology. The growth of the productive forces has generated new sectors, computing, for example. True, capitalism has seized for itself these gains in the productive forces and the integration of science into production, and yet, the result has been a socialization of society, and of the productive forces themselves, whose elements, firms, are no longer isolated, separated in space, something that Marx had predicted as the work of socialist society. What prevents this qualitative leap? The Hegelian type of nation-state, with its repressive power, its constraining structures, its frozen forms, formalities and formations, its satisfying functions. In short, with the weight of its institutions based on productivism and quantitativism. B. In the medium term, Marx proclaimed within the bounds of the predictable the formation of a different society, characterized by what modalities of existence? Marx had little to say about the future society that would be born from a total revolution. He refused to write recipes for the cookshops of the future. Sometimes, it seems, he saw it in ethical terms, each person respecting all all others, sometimes aesthetic, everyone a poet or artist. It was predictable that this future society would be characterized initially by collective, and thus social, ownership and management of the productive forces and the means of production, in other words, of the economy. Subsequently, by the disappearance, withering away, of the political state and of the political as such. Thus, by the predominance of the social over the economic, controlled, and the political, reabsorbed. This predominance of the social, and of social, collective, needs, is what defined socialism and then communism according to Marx. It implied for him diversity, the riches of social relations. True riches, the appropriation or reappropriation by social man of his conditions and means, nature, technology, science, etc. It also implied the end of repressive and oppressive institutions, along with the state, before or after it, religion, family, nation and fatherland, imposed labor, ideology, etc. would also disappear. What if this project has been realized? Nothing, or as good as nothing. And yet, a large part of the things whose disappearance Marx announced is already rotting rather than growing stronger. See, in the long term, Marx's thought regains the upper hand. In several texts, from the Poverty of Philosophy to the Grundrisse, the preparatory work for Capital, whose texts are not the most famous or vulgarized, Marx analyzed machinery, the stages and complex process of its perfection, the combination of tools, the use of other energies than human, the material application of technology and scientific results. Marx foresaw the coming of automatic machinery in the automation of production, something Hegel had already envisaged, though without basing his prediction on a precise study of this abstract concrete object, a study that was made possible for Marx by the work of Babbage, one of the founders of this technology. Machinery, increasingly complex, would receive from outside, in relation to its internal functioning, energies and raw materials. It would transform these by a self-regulated process into finished products, making human labor unnecessary. The infinite division of labor would be reunited as a productive process in automatic machinery. This long-term prediction of non-labor is one of Marx's prophecies. Despite being in no way eschatological or millenarian in the traditional sense, Marx sensed that this decisive perfection of productive forces would bring about a revolutionary change in the world. It contained within it the most contradictory possibilities, catastrophes or miracles, or both at once. If the political and social revolution did not take place, the upheaval of technology would be responsible for transforming the world. But if societies were not ready to accept it, to control technology, to ensure the appropriation of the world for human beings, then the worst consequences would result. What would people do if they no longer had to work, yet would still have to feed machinery with energy and raw materials? How would these enormous units of production be managed, dispersed as they are across the Earth's surface as a function of flows of energy and resources of raw materials? How would they be subordinated to social needs? And what needs? In fragments that have been ignored until recently, Marx even foresaw that an agglomeration, a city, occupying an urban space would have an energy balance. In other words, an exchange of resources with the surrounding space, the countryside, and that further away. How would these exchanges be governed? Without control of this process, rational regulation, urban reality risks destroying its own resources and even itself. Foreseeing so-called ecological questions, without however thinking that they might become the most important, Marx envisaged a global self-regulation of productive processes, but did not think that a regulation of exchanges at the highest level, between town and country, for example, could happen automatically, without the intervention of activity and cognition. These questions and indications can be discovered today in fragments from Marx that do not form part of the Vulgate. Clear and distinct they are not. They have to be read with 20th century eyes, and interpreted as a function of a century of experience. How can there be a different procedure for studying texts that have no relationship to literature, differing from this both by their form, a different language from the everyday, without this language being singularized by the individual effort of the author, and by their content, an analysis of the actual oriented towards the virtual? Hegel had already defined this procedure, regressive deepening from the beginning. In this case, the thought of Marx and progressive determination of this beginning as such, reprised each time in a different manner, without there being a definitive reading and a fixed meaning. For, as far as the state is concerned, there is no model of political reality to be found in the work of Marx. Against this, we find throughout his work a detailed critical examination of Hegelian theory, more than several polemical remarks against this or that statesman, remarks that also aim at the corresponding state. Why this absence? In Marx's time, the state was beginning its shattering career. Apart from its existence in the texts of Hegel, there was a political entity only in France. Marx saw the collapse of Bonapartism in France and the rise of the state in Germany with Bismarck and Prussia. In England, tied to the world market and the beginnings of capitalism, the state remained weak. Perhaps Marx saw the critique of Hegelian theory as sufficient, without replacing it by a different construction. Perhaps he deemed state architectures too fragile, too quickly modified, to deserve a theoretical elaboration, or perhaps he was never able to grasp the links between the state and the capitalist mode of production. Having only the English example available to him, Marx could not accuse Hegel of ignoring production and misunderstanding the productive process with its double aspect, in the narrow sense, labor, economic activities, productive forces, the manufacture of objects conforming to demand and needs, and more broadly, the production of social relations and society, the self-production of human reality. The Hegelian philosophy of history and the self-production of his own reality by man was subjected to the filter of Feuerbach's anthropology. Who lives and acts? A palpable and sentient being, a subject-object that is born from nature and never emerges from it, even if he modifies it. Hegel conceived productive activity in its full amplitude, detaching it from nature in the name of reason, the idea. Feuerbach restored naturalism by misunderstanding activity. Marx restored the unity of social human being by superseding Hegel's speculative rationality and Feuerbach's limited naturalism by breaking their limits in a dialectical movement. He perceived, moreover, the new problems that emerge with the superseding. How can a being of nature, born of nature, living from it and in it, dominate it, if there is not a rationality that is both higher and immanent to this becoming? What happens to man when he masters nature by cognition? Marx rather left these questions in suspense in the 7,844 manuscripts. Content to characterize human alienation practically and socially. The human being does not wrest himself from nature in order to dominate it without pains and risks. Labor itself, which Hegel, a bourgeois ignorant of it, unconditionally praises by subordinating it to knowledge, his own. This labor, alienated because divided, subjects the laboring individual, on the one hand to the technical demands of the productive process, and on the other hand to the social demands of the market itself. Double, the labor market, and the market for the products of labor. First remark, neither production nor market possesses the internal equilibrium that Hegel attributes to them, presupposing a harmony between the system of labors and the system of needs. Hegelianism was bad at interpreting the discoveries of the English economists. The regulation of the market, to the extent that this exists, results from the bitterest competition, which eliminates the less well-endowed and the less well-placed. The market does not promote a higher rationality and an ascent towards the idea, but rather the rise of the powerful and rich. The victims of the market in the division of labor include above all the laborers themselves. Hegel's optimism does not hold up to critical analysis. Was Hegel unaware of social classes? No, but he misunderstood their essence, and therefore their role. In the French Revolution he saw only the rational rise of the nation-state, almost completely ignoring the class struggle between bourgeoisie and aristocracy. Something discovered however by Saint Simon in the early 19th century, though grasping economic production on the one hand and social classes on the other. He did not conceive their connection. His speculative triadic construction drove him into an enormous mistake. For him there were the two laboring and thus productive classes: peasants, workers, artisans, and above them two other classes. The hierarchy of the thinking class, a political class or rather a caste, and the ruling class, governors, government, where in this construction are the means and relations of production. Who possesses the means of production, in the name of property relations? An illusion of rationality and harmony disturbed Hegel's vision. The middle class, for Marx, as against Hegel, this does not have a well-defined existence. There are middle classes and strata. The name changes. Marx pejoratively calls petite bourgeoisie what the Hegelian philosophy of the state decorates with the fine name of thinking class. This supposed class is made up, for Marx, of very diverse elements. Certain agriculturalists, themselves a very varied group: agricultural workers, sharecroppers, capitalist or non-capitalist farmers, landed proprietors belong to it, along with merchants, the liberal professions, civil servants, etc. Unproductive? No. Many, if not all, produce in their fashion. Even the criminal, bound by a determinate legal tie to the means of production? No. Only the capitalists possess these means: premises, machinery, raw materials, wage funds. Merchants, they produce in their way, as the transport of goods from one place to another is part of their production. Through the work of his personnel, the merchant produces surplus value just as the industrialist does. By the same title, he receives a share of this surplus value, in proportion to the capital invested in his firm. The larger the scale of commerce, the more similar it is to industry. The same holds for agricultural undertakings. But there are many small and medium merchants, many small and medium officials, etc., who make up the petite bourgeoisie. These middle classes may well have the ability to reflect, that is, to go from uncertainty to uncertainty. They have neither the capacity to direct production nor that of orienting the political ensemble. Their quantitative and qualitative importance is certainly considerable, but in no way does it correspond to the role that Hegel assigns them. Lassalle, an inconsistent Hegelian, cheated, and his supporters along with him, when they said that the middle classes, vis-a-vis a politically active working class, formed a reactionary mass together with the bourgeoisie. For Lassalle, this absurdity concealed a dangerous tactic, to hold out a hand to the feudalists and Bismarck himself, who had arisen from the feudalists despite outclassing them in the scope of his political views. Lassalle forgot that the bourgeoisie overturned society by industry in a revolutionary way, and that the proletariat, as the most authentic product of this overthrow arising from large scale industry, aims to strip production of its capitalist character. It is true that the ruling personnel are drawn selectively, by examinations and competitions, from these middle classes, and ranked in a hierarchy. Here, Marx had a stroke of genius, one among so many others, expressed initially in a different language. For the body of state officials, whom Hegel constantly praised for their competence, devotion and honesty, a triad of virtues, Marx immediately found the word bureaucracy. That led him to a fundamental discovery, which would pertain to what is today called sociology, if that specialized science had raised itself to critical cognition. The bureaucracy, as a constituted social body, has its own particular interests. It seeks to maintain, and even expand and extend, the domain over which it rules, to preserve its cohesion as a body and numerically. So, if bureaucrats take measures to manage society, as a function of the resources attributed to them and their sources, the national income, and gross national product, they take this from others so as to persevere in their social being, and they do this within the political order. The rationality or irrationality of that order is of little concern to them. Besides, the rational and the irrational are mingled, the first turning to absurdity and the second working itself out in very well-reasoned formalisms and texts. The bureaucrats accept this situation as a premise of their action, insofar as rationality matters to them. It is the rationality of their preservation. The function of functionaries is duplicated: public management and control of the social ensemble, self-preservation of the various constituted bodies and of the bureaucratic ensemble a social body. If there is self-regulation, then, it is not a political totality that benefits, as Hegel wished, but a part of society, which cuts out a place for itself and expands this in a constant struggle. This struggle is superimposed on others, and tends to conceal these rather than to simplify them. The contradiction runs right to the heart of the state edifice, fissuring it from top to bottom. On the one hand, the bureaucracy, with its higher stratum or caste of managers, whom Marx does not yet call technocrats, but whose rise he anticipated, manages the social ensemble, in other words, the state, the public services, education and teaching, health, scientific research, etc. For these activities, the bureaucracy has at its disposal the social surplus product, which it levies by various means, taxes, state corporations, etc. We know how much this question of surplus product and its management preoccupied Marx in his critique of the Gotha program of 1875. The bureaucracy organizes and manages these services, taking into account the interests concerned, and consequently the interests of the economically dominant, the capitalists, and the bourgeoisie as a class. By the mediation of these bureaucrats, the economically dominant class tends, this is in no way a fait accompli, a state of things given from the start, to exercise its hegemony, to shape even needs, knowledge and social space, although not without resistance, including resistance arising from the self-defense of various institutions sheltered by the bureaucracy. But at the same time, and we cannot insist too much on this simultaneity, the bureaucratic political apparatuses tend to set themselves above society, to dominate it instead of managing it. The rise of the whole towards abstraction, applauded by Hegel as a sign and proof of rationality, has this absurd aspect. The managers of society, ceasing to act on behalf of the dominant class, acquire an autonomous reality. In the extreme case, they are able to impose their specific interests. They end up pillaging the whole of society, including the economically dominant class handling it despite its energetic resistance. This acquisition of autonomy, which enables the state and its apparatuses to weigh heavily on society and the social as such, is not without its inconveniences. In the absence of democratic control from below, the elements of the social body divide. They compete with one another for power and its advantages. Set above society, the state crumbles along its lines of cleavage. Like any other system, acute rivalry engenders violence, either the military or politicians, possessing an apparatus, profit from this situation, disdaining the possessors of knowledge, the higher technicians and technocrats, who however often take their revenge, as they are indispensable for the management of society. Marx explains this double dialectical movement within the state and its apparatuses in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, after having already described and analyzed its conditions in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of the state. In 1852, a group of political adventurers and officers seized hold of French society and set out to pillage it. A lumpen bourgeoisie, allied to the lumpen proletariat, seized the state already erected over society and took this process to its conclusion, just as fascism did later. Marx revealed in Bonapartism this tendency on the part of the state, as soon as it escapes democratic control from below. A tendency Marx only ever analyzed tendencies. Movements, processes, in other words, becomings. Is this the Hegelian state? No, but it is what awaits it, its destination if nothing threatens it from below. Marx revealed the social reality of the political state. It has, as Hegel discovered despite misunderstanding his own discovery, a social basis, the relations of production. As a consequence, the working class, bound to these relations of production precisely by the fact that it has no immediate relationship with production but only mediated relationships contractual, since there is a contract, verbal or written, between employer and employee, with the owners of the means of production. This working class is part of the basis. The state weighs on it. The political events in France from 1848 to 1852 illustrate this entire process. The French state, already strong under the Ancien regime, then strengthened and centralized by Napoleon, was still in no way a modern state. The edifice was constructed on an agricultural basis. The state bureaucracy, the administration, connected a multitude of isolated units of production. The small peasants of the villages and small towns. The Restoration emphasized the artificial character of the state construction. As its basis changed, the peasantry shifted and the working class appeared. In 1848 this manifested itself and the edifice shattered. The Republic failed either to reconstitute or reconstruct it as a function of the new realities, industry and the working class. Then adventurers came along, and seized this proud prey in a coup d'état, weighing on the working class. Therefore, is a modern political construction, both to maintain the relations of production, to organize consumption, and if possible to supervise production, to guarantee the surplus value destined for the whole of society. The various services, there is nothing stable, balanced or rational about this basis. The productive forces, they grow and conditions change. The relations of production, they relegate private property of the means of production, including land, into the realm of the irrational, even if its political weight increases. Classes, their number constantly changes. Classes disappear as such. Landed proprietors in France, for instance, and others are born. The fragmented peasants after the French Revolution and its agrarian reform. A further paradox. The Hegelian construction expresses a reality, a certain result of history, and on top of this a project, a hope, a perspective that of the bourgeoisie, something that Hegel to a certain point ignored, misunderstanding his own presuppositions, in the way of every philosopher, to the extent that Marx elaborated a theory of the state. This starts as a critique of Hegelian theory in his early works, is continued as a polemic against Bonapartism, and culminates in an attack on the German Social Democratic Party aiming through this at its inspirer, Ferdinand Lassalle. The Berlin Marat. Through Lassalle it reaches the Hegelian target, so that this final text reprises and concludes the first. Marx's constant theme, the present conditions of property are maintained by the power of the state, which the bourgeoisie has organized to protect the conditions of its property. The proletarians must therefore overthrow the political power. 1847. The critique of the Gotha program deserves deeper study, for many reasons. This text, obscured by interested parties the German Social Democrats, first of all remained unknown, and then was not understood. Before returning to this short and condensed text, which I have already drawn widely on, let us take one highly important remark. Does Marx allude to the Commune? He mentions this only in connection with the end of the First International. Now, he was perfectly aware of what had happened in Paris in 1871, and approved it particularly as far as the state was concerned, as well as some bold but fruitless measures. The Communards broke the existing state, a bourgeois state that was very far from democratic, established on the ruins of Bonapartism. By demolishing the bureaucracy, the police and the army, the apparatus is set up above and against the people. The Communards showed the way. Marx's critique of the Gotha program says nothing of all this, and it is only between the lines that the reader finds there the Commune. There were two reasons for this. First of all, Marx knew that he could not speak to the Germans, 4 years after, about what had been done in Paris. They were unaware of it or rejected it because these socialists were imbued with nationalist prejudices. They situated themselves, as Marx angrily said, within the framework of the present-day national state, thus in the Bismarckian context, going so far as to forget that the German Empire was situated economically in the context of the world market and politically in the system of states. This was more than the national framework, with the result that verbiage about the fraternity of peoples replaced the common struggle of the working classes against the ruling classes and their governments. Second, we can believe a century later that this situation already disturbed Marx, that he had difficulty understanding it. What happened? In his own time, the working class of the most powerful European country organized itself politically. It drew inspiration from him, Marx, by way of a man who knew the Communist Manifesto by heart, Lassalle. And now this working class, already powerful both qualitatively and quantitatively, fell into the crudest of traps: nationalism, statism. What a blow to Marx. His own work was escaping him. How and why? Did he sense that the working class would not be protected from contradictions? That it would not accomplish its historic mission, at a single stroke, with a powerful simplicity? If Marx suspected this, he did not say so, but he closely analyzed the internal contradictions of the German Workers' Party. Within it, the working class began to mix revolutionary verbalism with opportunist formulae like Lassalle, waxing about the iron law of wages while cozying up to the most reactionary class on the pretext that it rejected capitalism. Similarly, the German Workers' Party campaigned for the emancipation of labor and the abolition of the wage system. By what means? The establishment of production cooperatives with the support of the state, a supposedly free state. Section 11 of the program. A free state. What does that mean? One Marx asked. An independent state? A state free in its movements as a state? Dangerous nonsense. Freedom consists in converting the state from an organ superimposed on society into one thoroughly subordinate to it. And even today state forms are more or less free depending on the degree to which they restrict the freedom of the state. This dissolves the program's monstrous confusions and abuses of language. As for the state in general, it is a fiction. Modern states, established on the common foundation of bourgeois society, built within a more or less developed capitalism, will accordingly have essential characteristics in common along with secondary differences. When the German Workers' Party declared that it accepted the existing political framework, the state of the Prusso-German Empire, it seriously mortgaged the future. It ruled out in advance the essential element of the revolutionary transformation that changes capitalist into communist society. In other words, the transition phase in which the state can only be the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. Engels and Lenin would take this Marxist thesis to its logical conclusion. What did the revolution consist of on the political level? 3 connected and successive acts: to break the existing state in a particular national conjuncture, to construct a different political edifice, that of proletarian dictatorship, or rather, hegemony, and to bring the state and politics to an end by their withering away, not by disintegration, rotting, etc. More briefly, 2 active verbs: reabsorb the political sphere and absorb the economic one into the social, by establishing the priority of the latter. Such is the strategic objective. Marx goes on to ask, in revealing terms, what social functions will remain that are analogous to the present functions of the state one in the society he envisages. Political functions, supposing that politics did have certain functions, will have disappeared and been replaced by social functions. There is no longer a question of economic functions. The social emancipated, as was said at this time, would expand once relieved of economics and politics. It would develop as such. Social functions, which would be no more than analogous to those of the political state, would depend on a rational, scientific analysis of society. And, Marx added, it was not by coupling the word people with the word state that progress would be made towards solving this problem. Only cognition of the social ensemble could resolve it, by becoming social practice. What social functions are these? Essentially, the levying and managing of the surplus product, the project of attributing to each worker the fruit of his labor or its equivalent, revolutionary and bold as it seems, is in fact meaningless. Once hegemonic, the working class will have to make the whole of society function, and draw from the total result of production what is indispensable for the continuation of services described as public or of general interest, if transformed in their content, education, training, health, etc., along with scientific research, art, etc. A serious question is whether armaments and an army should form part of these applications of the social product. The answer is no, except in the case of such a threat that the whole people has to arm in order to resist the operations of an opposing strategy, a class strategy. It is appropriate here to repeat that this theory of the social surplus product has been neglected by the majority of Marxist currents. Why? Because it is chiefly, though not exclusively, to be found in the critique of the Gotha program, a misunderstood text. Also because Marxists have been so concerned with great philosophical questions, or with specialized sciences, history, political economy, that they have left aside the social in the strict sense, also misunderstood in its specificity. And finally, because political and trade union militancy has always emphasized, and still does, questions about production, thus the firm, wages, etc., neglecting the other moments of social reality. Only one very remarkable thinker, despite or because of his aberrance, Georges Batterel, took up the analysis of the social surplus product in his book The Accursed Share. He interpreted the theory in an original and paradoxical way. For him, the real stake in class struggles is this surplus product, its levying and its use, all the more so as this surplus, this excess available to societies, makes possible everything that goes beyond the hard life of productive labor and the everyday round: wars, festivals, religious sacrifices, pleasure, luxury, works of art, monuments, in short, what economists treat as waste, useless expenditure, yet what makes life agreeable. The surplus product makes it possible to fight, and is what people fight for. Batterel illustrated his theory with pre-capitalist examples. It could be that it had truth value for societies in which the ruling classes, aristocracy, clergy, still had to take the people into account, the survivals of primitive community or military democracy, the traditions of general assemblies in villages and towns, obliging notables to sumptuous expenditure in the sense of Thorstein Veblen's leisure class. Is this still true under capitalism? Less and less, or more and more, especially if we consider armaments as waste. This expenditure has taken other forms: foundations, donations, etc. As for waste, either it is hidden, whether public, bureaucratic, or private, or it ceases to be extra-economic and becomes economic, the accelerator of growth and production. As Vance Packard has shown, we have to accept, however, that the class struggle is not restricted to questions of wages at the level of the firm, but covers the whole of society, affected as this is by the hegemonic management of the social fund levied on surplus value. After Marx's critique of and response to Hegel, peremptory as it was, what remains of the Hegelian thesis of a perfect rationality in the existing state or the state in general? Philosophical architectures, like political constructions, display a limited rationality. The working class will go further in reason than the bourgeoisie, according to Marx, after a leap, qualitative, that is, revolutionary. It is in this sense that, for Marx, the working class receives the legacy of philosophy and makes it fruitful at a higher level. The working class will act according to its theoretical analysis, according to the indications of cognition, instead of proceeding either speculatively, like philosophers, or empirically, like professional politicians. The error or illusion of Hegelian rationality consists in its underestimating contradictions and believing them easy to resolve, as if cognition of conflicts already contained their solution. Hegel the dialectician disavowed and rejected his own dialectic. For Marx, the state summit, the supreme instance, cannot really cognize or resolve the contradictions that arise from this double eruption that puts an end to the old historicity. Industry, the working class, this class, according to Marx, has a dialectical privilege corresponding to its mission being not historical but universal. It cannot assert itself without superseding or negating itself. If it becomes collective subject, and thus political subject, and seizes the state by revolutionary means, this will be to negate both the state and politics by bringing these to their end. The process, for Marx, includes three moments. The working class asserts itself, and therefore shatters and destroys the existing society, including the state. This assertion, positive at the same time as negative, qualitative although quantitative, introduces a transitional period during which the now hegemonic class will be faced with multiple problems, those of the global management of society, which presupposes organizations and coherent actions, thus a kind of state and political life. Subsequently, the social develops, the state will have withered away and disappeared, while the socially controlled economy is no longer a distinct and prior level. Many objections can be raised to this theoretical schema, still triadic as ever, and a bit simplistic. It does not take into account either the unevennesses of economic growth and development, glimpsed by Marx, but whose theoretical concepts and laws would be clearly formulated by Lenin, or political obstacles, wars, repressions and constant violence. Besides, what prevents statesmen from acquiring a broader knowledge than the remote vision of what they see in the far distance? The state, if we venture to speak so familiarly of such an admirable reality, does not let itself be pushed around. The hypothesis that the state fissures and crumbles by hardening has no more consistency than a metaphor. It too readily lends itself to subversive rhetoric. It seems to fuel two modern myths already mentioned, that of the Titan Prometheus who attacked the gods, and that of the evil demon who uses a vulnerable detail to demolish the edifice. And yet, this debatable schema contains the revolutionary capacity of Marxist thought. It actualizes the concept of freedom, which a century after its expression by Marx remains the most subtle and strongest thing that Western rationality has developed, with the result that we find ourselves faced with dilemma, either to accept the schema, or else to concede an irremediable opposition between the irrational and the rational. The VQ of live experience and the concours of conceptual thought. A limited conception of freedom runs through Hegelianism, along with a limited conception of reason, underlying the philosophy of knowledge and emerging in the theory of the state. Freedom is defined by cognition of necessity of determinism, a thesis that has the advantage of combining with the philosophical tradition of logos, subject and object, discourse and reason the scientific discoveries of the modern age. Starting with Galileo and Descartes, Hegel develops in minute detail the moments of freedom, three in number. It goes without saying, the free will, individual desire that declares itself free, is only an initial moment, empty and uncertain. Freedom is confused with arbitrariness. The undermined will, the L as pure subjective activity, must be limited and determined to attain existence, to will something, and thus to be will. Decision, determination and knowledge go together. The free will, that is generally known as freedom, trusts to chance. This is a level at which the majority of people remain in practice, and so, even on an ideological level that believes itself superior, does so-called liberal thought. The freedom of the individual is the art of taking advantage of accident, chance or mischance. Nothing more contradictorily, Hegel says, the ordinary man believes himself free when he is permitted to act arbitrarily, but it is precisely in this arbitrariness that he is not free. When I will the rational, I'll act not as particular individual but according to the notions of ethics. This first degree of freedom, however, subjective and incoherent, acquires with property an objective and already necessary existence. This contributes to leading the will that seeks freedom towards the second moment, morality. At this degree, it recognizes other wills, it is reflected in them and reflects them in itself, thus advancing towards a substantial reality that it attains only at the third moment. This unites and supersedes the two others, subjective and libjective, arbitrary and substantial. Freedom is then defined as actuality that conforms to its concept, as a totality of necessity, cognized and recognized in the family, civil society and the state. It follows from this that morality and right, rational custom and law, go together, as do needs and labors. It also follows that the system of right constitutes the determination and realization of freedom. The world of the spirit generated by itself a second nature. Right and morality guarantee the individual against arbitrariness from without and against the arbitrariness of his own free will. The highest freedom consists in cognition and recognition, thus acceptance of the systems implicated in the state, needs, labors, right, morality. For Hegel, nothing is more rigorous than this definition or determination of freedom, yet on examination it soon reveals its ambiguity. It may be twisted in the most varied directions. Does this cognition or recognition of necessity mean accepting it, or rather struggling against it so as to dominate it and free oneself from it? In Hegelianism, Western logos postulates its lucidity and univocity, its signification, which immediately duplicates and even shatters the discovery of astronomical laws, from Kepler to Newton, did not make it possible to modify phenomena, only to predict them. On the other hand, the doctor familiar with the determinism, cause-effect, of a disease can intervene and sometimes cure the patient. The concept of cognition diversifies. Not only does it distinguish itself from knowledge and specialized cognitions, it calls for new categories. Sometimes cognition makes it possible to dominate a connection of facts, to control and thus modify them. Sometimes it does not enable this, and is limited to more or less precise prediction, often probabilistic. Sometimes cognition makes it possible to appropriate or reappropriate processes to the needs and desires of the being who cognizes and lives in society. These concrete differences overturn Hegelian theory, as Marx very well grasped, without developing the differential concepts that he attempted in the works of his youth. In particular, appropriation in the 7,844 manuscripts, where he strongly contrasts this with property, showing that the latter prevents the former. For Marx, freedom is defined on the social level, and only on this level, to the exclusion of economic determinisms as such and political constraints as such. Who is this individual? A social being, says Marx, a node or nucleus, a mobile center of social relations. Their degree of practical and concrete reality, thus of freedom, depends on the complexity and wealth of these relationships. Here, wealth in social relations is contrasted with wealth in money as appropriate to property. Poverty in social relations may go together with wealth in things, in money and capital. Conversely, wealth in relationships often goes together with poverty, in things and money. The one does not exclude the other, otherwise any hope would have to be abandoned. Social relations include relations of production, but they envelop these by superseding them. Thus, social relationships that bear the names culture or artistic production go beyond the technical and social division of labor. The wealth of social relations, a complexity more than a complication,